The 9,378th meeting of the Security Council is resumed. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Dominique Hser, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Liechtenstein.
Mr. President, it is my honor to address the Security Council today on a topic that is particularly dear to me. The Women, Peace and Security agenda, including the protection and support of victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, is a priority of Liechtenstein's foreign policy, and I am personally committed to the cause. As a result of escalating violence, militarization, and weakened rule of law protections, civilians bear the brunt of armed conflicts across the globe. Sexual violence is used as a weapon of war to attack civilian populations and to break societies, communities, and families. Such violence is documented in virtually every conflict worldwide, including in Myanmar, Ukraine, and Yemen. All these situations require the urgent attention of the respective accountability mechanisms. In the case of Ukraine, we will in particular be looking for expeditious investigations by the International Criminal Court. I also wanted to highlight our appreciation for the briefing this morning of Hser, which reflects her tireless advocacy on behalf of the women of Myanmar. We are pleased to see the Security Council pass Resolution 2669 last December. Given the worsening situation on the ground, we believe that it is now time for the Council to seriously consider a follow-up text that will bring accountability for the crimes committed in Myanmar, including conflict-related sexual violence. Mr. President, all acts of sexual violence are not only morally repugnant, they are categorically prohibited under international humanitarian and human rights law. They constitute war crimes and may amount to crimes against humanity and genocide. Concrete, time-bound preventive measures, as explicitly outlined in Security Council Resolutions 2106 and 2467, are necessary to bring an end to these atrocities. We reiterate our call on the Council to include conflict-related sexual violence as a designation criterion in targeted sanctioned crimes. Such measures are in line with a complementary to the Act Code of Conduct regarding Security Council action against genocide, crime against humanity, or war crimes. The Code of Conduct is now supported by 129 states, including the majority of this Council's membership. Although widespread and often systematic sexual violence against men and boys remains underreported due to stigma, cultural taboo, and lack of criminalization. As a result, male survivors of sexual violence are often unable to access legal remedies as well as medical and mental health services. The pioneering work by the Liechtenstein-based international NGO All Survivors Project has helped to advance awareness through tireless advocacy. Its work has informed Security Council Resolution 2467, which has paved the way for strengthened accountability in this regard. This Council should consistently call on states to live up their obligation to investigate and prosecute conflict-related sexual violence in line with the primacy of national systems. The international justice system must be engaged where national systems fail due to inability or unwillingness. Mr. President, international criminal justice mechanisms have significantly advanced our efforts to fight impunity. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the 25th anniversary of which we celebrate on Monday, has played a vital role in ending impunity for sexual violence crimes. It is the first international criminal law instrument that explicitly recognizes forms of sexual violence, such as rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, and enforced sterilization, as distinct war crimes and crimes against humanity. It urges states parties to appoint judges with special legal expertise on gender-based violence and requests the court to provide special protections to victims, including with regard to age and gender. In practice, the ICC has done pioneering work to hold perpetrators to account by establishing a comprehensive and victim-centered framework. It has firmly established conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence as crimes against humanity and war crimes. We commend the Office of the Prosecutor for including charges related to sexual and gender-based crimes in many of their cases and for prioritizing these crimes as a matter of policy. The case of Boskundanga resulted in a milestone verdict as sexual violence crimes committed against males were held to the same standards as those committed against females. The ICC's judgments against Dominique Ongwen also succeeded in painting a comprehensive picture of sexual and gender-based crimes suffered by victims and constitute important precedent for the future cases. Dedicated gender expertise in investigative teams, including our partners from Justice Rapid Response, is crucial for the ICC and other regional and international accountability mechanisms in this regard. Mr. President, no person should ever have to go through the terrifying and traumatizing experience of conflict-related sexual violence. We must therefore redouble our efforts to prevent its occurrence. At root, this means combating structural gender inequality and promoting the participation and leadership of women in public life. By ensuring women's rights to full, equal and meaningful participation, we contribute to the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence and to the health of our society as a whole.
Her Excellency Ms. Hser for her statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you. Mr. President, Poland thanks the United Kingdom for convening this important debate and for its efforts to advance the implementation of the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We also thank the Secretary General for his comprehensive report on the issue and lend our support to the mandate and activities of SRSG, Pramila Patten. Poland aligns itself with the statements of the EU and WPS group of friends. The use of sexual violence as weapons or tactics of war is widespread. Conflict-related sexual violence remains a significant global concern, affecting primarily women and girls, but we should not forget to account for the male victims as well. Poland stands in solidarity with all victims and survivors and calls for greater support that encompasses recognition of their suffering, elimination of stigma, provision of medical and psychosocial assistance. Impunity and the lack of accountability have allowed conflict-related sexual violence to persist. By holding perpetrators accountable, we can send a powerful message to victims and survivors that their voices have been heard, and to offenders that the days of empty warnings are over. Poland emphasized the significance of women's participation in processes aimed at addressing sexual violence, including peace talks. Female negotiators can ensure a survivor-centered approach, facilitate the rehabilitation of survivors, secure post-conflict reparations, promote accountability, and establish vetting mechanisms to exclude perpetrators from security forces. We support peacekeeping and monitoring missions to provide adequate protection for all victims. In this vein, we endorse the deployment of Women's Protection Advisor and the use of early warning indicators to address conflict-related sexual violence. Mr. President, as a neighbor of Ukraine, hosting currently the largest community of Ukrainian refugees, Poland condemns the deliberate use of sexual violence by Russian soldiers as a tactic of war and intimidation. We welcome the reference to these appalling practices in the report. The massive displacement caused by Russian aggression has heightened the risks of all forms of sexual violence. In response, Poland has swiftly implemented new measures to support Ukrainian citizens seeking refuge in our country that SRSG Patten kindly referred to in her briefing. Since the consequences of CRSV extend beyond the physical dimension and have lasting impacts on survivors' lives, effective prevention and multisectoral response mechanisms are crucial in post-conflict settings. Mindful of this, Poland's Ministry of Health has initiated an intensive therapy pilot program aimed at providing trauma treatment for women survivors in conflict and post-conflict environments. Mr. President, accountability is essential to ensure compliance with international obligations. Failure to take decisive action will only encourage further abuse. Consequently, Poland actively assists the International Criminal Court in collecting evidence of war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. To this end, we have established a joint investigation team with Lithuania and Ukraine. Additionally, the Rafael Lemkin Center for Documenting Russian Crimes in Ukraine has been established in Warsaw. Its purpose is to gather and preserve evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as record witness testimonies. There are numerous unreported cases for each one that comes to light. We have a moral obligation in support of the courageous survivors who have come forward, as well as those who have been silenced by fear. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statements. Colleagues, let me remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. Flashing lights on the collars of the microphones will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. Now, I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. President. In the beginning, I would like to thank the United Kingdom for holding this debate on a very critical topic that still has serious dimensions due to the spread of armed conflict and the related atrocities that target women and girls. My country, Algeria, condemns in the strongest terms all forms of sexual violence against women and girls in all their forms and manifestations in all contexts. These practices are totally prohibited and have no place in our world currently and in the future. We believe in the importance of fighting all forms of violence, particularly those targeting women and girls. Hence, we have ratified all international agreements towards combating violence against women, so that we can respond to their aspirations and establish a culture and value that would fight all forms of marginalization of women and to guarantee their participation in sustainable development. Algeria has always been a pioneer in developing a national strategy to combat violence against women and girls since the year 2007. This includes 3 areas of intervention: tailored services, mobilizing society, social solidarity, building alliances. In line with this strategy, we hold regular trainings for the judiciary, gendarmerie, the police to guarantee effective implementation. Further, we have updated laws to protect women from all forms of violence and adopting a number of protection mechanisms that are implemented in coordination with the different sectors at the local levels, the civil society and the media. Also, we have supported updating the legislation to limit violence. This reflects the political will at the highest levels in the country. This has included adding an article that condemns violence against women in the Constitution and makes it incumbent upon the state to protect women everywhere and under all circumstances. Here, through this debate, we are implementing the existing frameworks adopted by the Security Council as set forth in the Secretary General's report S/2023/413 and the included recommendations. Algeria, as we have explained, has worked to update and develop an arsenal of laws, policies that is robust to combat violence against women and girls. And we work within the Council, outside the Council, to combat this phenomenon, especially at times of conflict, for a world free from violence. We value the role of women to resolve conflicts. Women in Algeria has had an effective role to fight terrorism in the 90s And due to their participation, we were able to overcome this crisis and end this scourge. Hence, and based on our national capacity in fighting, experience in fighting violence against women, we stress the following points. 1, we need to update legal frameworks and legislation to be in line with the current transformation in the world as we see a spread of conflicts and the changing nature of conflicts. And they need to be in line with the international community body of instruments, particularly Security Council resolutions. Second, we need to implement relevant Security Council resolutions. Despite many resolutions being adopted by the Council, starting from Resolution 1820 to Resolution 2467, sexual violence at times of armed conflict, as set forth in the different reports, is prevalent. Hence, we need to take the measures to guarantee the implementation of these resolutions through inclusion of such elements in the mandates of peacekeeping operations, and to strictly penalize the perpetrators, and we need security forces to protect women from any sexual violence during conflicts. 3, we need to adopt a comprehensive approach, particularly that the task to protect women from sexual violence at times of conflict is not limited to a particular body. We need a concerted effort, including that of the state institutions, international community, the UN, the civil society, so as to establish a system of legislation, security, and a judiciary that work against this phenomena. 4, victims of sexual violence need to access justice in a timely manner through very effective grievance mechanisms that provide reparation and remedy in the processes. 5, we need to fight impunity. Unfortunately, and as the Secretary General pointed out in his report, in most contexts, and I quote, in most contexts, impunity is the norm. A note from the interpreter, this is a quote back translated from Arabic. Hence, we need to punish all those who commit sexual violence against women, and we need the rule of law to prevail, and we need to build strong national institutions at the different levels so that we can reduce the threat of the CRSV against women and girls. 6, we need to address the root causes of sexual violence in conflicts through taking the necessary measures to address the structural causes that make women vulnerable and more susceptible to sexual violence during conflict. These include poverty, weak institutions, lack of development, through very clear policies that take into consideration the needs of women and enhance the meaningful participation of women in political development and security institutions. Mr. President, putting an end to CRSV is a priority, a moral and a political duty on all of us. It is unbelievable for the dignity of women and girls to be violated while we stand still in the face of this scourge and we are unable to hold perpetrators accountable. The best defense against CRSV is establishing societies where social justice, equal opportunities prevail, where all women and girls enjoy their rights and the equal protection of the law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, I thank the UK presidency for organising this debate and the distinguished briefers for sharing valuable insights. Croatia aligns itself with a statement of the European Union as well as groups of friends of women, peace and security and responsibility to protect. I would also like to add some remarks in my national capacity. As we mark the 15th anniversary of the Security Council resolution which condemned the use of sexual violence as weapon of war, the Secretary-General's report for 2022 shows that it still remains one of the most widespread human rights violations in conflict-affected countries. We must do everything we can to improve prevention, protect survivors and punish perpetrators. In this regard, let me thank the Special Representative of the Secretary-General on Sexual Violence in Conflict for her tireless efforts. Mr. President, sexual violence in conflict is closely related to discrimination of women and sexual violence in peacetime. In many countries, impunity prevails due to reluctance to prosecute crimes of sexual violence. This adds to a number of crimes that have already gone unreported as survivors fear retaliation and social stigma. We strongly encourage all states to align their laws with international humanitarian and human rights law, especially the CEDAW Convention and CEDAW Committee jurisprudence, as well as monitor their compliance with relevant Security Council resolutions. Tackling structural gender inequality should be prioritized in times of peace in order to minimize its effects during periods of instability. We also need to focus on a survivor-centered approach. As an example of such practice, Croatian survivors of sexual violence suffered in the homeland war are entitled to financial compensation and psychological support, even if perpetrators were never identified nor brought to justice. Finally, we fully support the Security Council to use sanctions against all parties, including mercenaries and private military companies, to prevent the recurrence of conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Croatia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, President. We are grateful to the United Kingdom for convening this annual open debate on conflict-related sexual violence and for the briefings we've heard. Mexico recognizes that progress has resulted from Resolution 1820 and subsequent resolutions, as well as the codification of sexual crimes as atrocities in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But nevertheless, these violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law still persist and are even worsening in situations such as those prevailing in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Haiti, or South Sudan, as stated in the most recent report of the Secretary-General. In this regard, Mexico wishes to highlight 3 calls to action. Firstly, it is crucial to guarantee access to justice and health services. This includes sexual and reproductive health and mental health for victims and survivors. In conflict contexts, this means granting a comprehensive support in order to facilitate the reintegration of survivors and to ensure that there is no impunity. It's important to recognize the importance of mental health and psychosocial support, which is gender-responsive, timely and sufficient. This is necessary not only for survivors, but also for the personnel of the United Nations peace operations. We call upon this Council to continue making progress within the provisions of Resolution 2668. Secondly, we support the deployment of women's protection advisors in peace operations and transition processes. The protection advisors enable the prevention of atrocities and provision of a timely response. It is also important to tackle the discrimination against women, the lack of representation, and the lack of services for survivors, which exacerbate the disproportionate impact of sexual violence on women and girls. Thirdly, a year ago, the presidencies of Ireland, Kenya and Mexico committed in this Council to making the Women, Peace and Security agenda a priority. Since then, the presidencies of 8 Council members, including the United Kingdom, have signed up to a declaration of shared commitments on this agenda. We urge all members of the Security Council to continue their commitment to this agenda, the WPS agenda. It's also necessary to continue compiling and analysing data broken down by gender. This will allow for a better understanding of the specific needs and the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. In conclusion, President, Mexico reaffirms the importance of addressing sexual violence related to conflict in a preventive way, as well as fostering and ensuring the effective participation of women in decision-making. Thank you.
Okay, for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guatemala.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Guatemala is grateful to the United Kingdom for convening this important open debate. And Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary-General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and very particularly Nadine and Hser, for the work they are doing to save future generations from this scourge. My delegation aligns itself with a statement made by the group of friends of the responsibility to protect. In our national capacity, I should like to make a few points. Sexual violence in conflict is a devastating phenomenon with damaging consequences for the victims. Women and girls are those who are exposed to greater precarity as a result of this scourge, which is used as a tactic of war, torture and terrorism during political crises and security crises, which are becoming increasingly serious and regular. These lead to displacement, separation of families and disappearance of loved ones. This situation runs counter not only to the norms of international humanitarian law, but also it undermines human dignity. It significantly exacerbates and prolongs conflict situations. It destroys the social fabric and prevents reconstruction efforts. My delegation has repeatedly condemned violence against women and girls in conflict situations, including sexual violence, and made calls to all parties to armed conflicts to desist from such acts immediately. Unfortunately, such actions continue to occur, and some situations have become systemic and generalized, reaching an alarming scale of brutality. We regret the fact that the level of compliance with applicable international norms by the parties to conflict, according to the report of the Secretary-General, continues to be disappointing, despite the fact that this Council has made the necessary efforts to establish robust regulatory frameworks. Proof of this is the devastating, illegal, unjustified and unprovoked attack of the Russian Federation on Ukraine. There is an increasing loss of lives, denial of humanitarian access, and increased risk of sexual violence and trafficking of persons due to the massive internal displacements. The data resulting from the investigations carried out by the International Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine are alarming, and it is beyond belief that children, girls under 4 years old, are part of these serious crimes. We commend the work done by the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary-General on Sexual Violence in Conflict in creating an interinstitutional working group to tackle this topic with a focus on people trafficking, providing assistance to survivors, access to justice and reparation. We urge the Council to apply sanctions and promote the commitment to tackling sexual violence in armed conflict. We believe that United Nations sanctions can be used as a tool to prevent and halt sexual violence in armed conflict and tackle the impunity enjoyed by perpetrators. President, to conclude, we believe that the new agenda for peace must include decisive actions to tackle the root causes of the use of sexual violence in conflict, the prevention of this violence, and new threats identified by the Special Representative, including the digital aspect. It's the responsibility of all of us to protect our populations from this scourge. Thank you very much.
Representative of Guatemala for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Costa Rica.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Costa Rica regrets the fact that sexual violence in armed conflict continues to be the norm and justice continues to elude victims from Myanmar to Ukraine and from Yemen to Haiti. In this regard, allow me to stress 3 points. First, the proliferation and illicit circulation of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition contribute to the facilitation and they perpetuate sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict settings, exacerbating the vulnerability of individuals. Consequently, disarmament and arms control is a key approach for preventing and addressing such atrocities, as is importantly acknowledged in the United Nations Framework on the Prevention of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. However, more needs to be done to articulate the practical links between disarmament and arms control and the Women, Peace and Security agenda, particularly at the multilateral level. Costa Rica calls upon this Council to promote and include disarmament and arms control considerations in its discussions and decisions on women, peace and security, to further advance the agenda's implementation. At a practical level, Costa Rica calls for greater harmonization between national strategies for implementing the Women, Peace and Security agenda and regulating small arms and light weapons by integrating small arms and light weapons control practices in the National Action Plans on Women, Peace and Security, and also the Women, Peace and Security considerations into the Small Arms and Light Weapons National Action Plans. This could constitute a stepping stone for furthering these efforts at the global level. Secondly, conflict-related sexual violence is not a women's issue, but a security issue, with much wider peace and security implications. Not only can rape serve as a precursor to conflict, a diagnosis of pre-conflict conditions and a symptom of impunity, but it is also evidence of a weak and insufficient security sector. A robust security sector will undoubtedly support women's participation and enhance protection mechanisms needed to eliminate such sexual violence within and outside conflict. Third, all resolutions under the umbrella of women, peace and security focus more on protecting women's bodies than unleashing their full potential. We must do more to redefine this agenda, such as by crafting a new standalone resolution that reframes education bans as a category of a structural form of violence against women and girls. President, it is critical that survivors remain at the heart of all our efforts. We must recognize that survivors have different needs and may face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. We must ensure that their rights are protected, that they are treated with dignity, that they are able to obtain access to justice, and that they can safely, fully and meaningfully participate in decision-making at all levels. I thank you.
Representative of Costa Rica for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. We are grateful to the Special Representative of the Secretary-General on Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict, Pramila Patten, for her presentation and particularly for her support to Colombia's efforts to prevent and eliminate sexual violence in our country. In Colombia, as in other parts of the world, this form of violence disproportionately affects women and girls. They represent 92.6% of all victims and are, in the great majority, Afro-descendants. Members of the LGBTIQ+ community and with diverse gender identities and sexual orientations have also suffered from sexual violence, seeking to impose heteronormality. With a view to eliminating and preventing sexual violence, the government of Gustavo Petro is taking a number of actions. Firstly, Colombia is drawing up its first feminist foreign policy. This is a pacifist policy which is participatory and intersectional, and at its heart is fighting gender-based violence. It underscores sexual violence happening both within and outside armed conflict therein. Secondly, after 23 years of indecision, Colombia is now working on its first national action plan on Resolution 1325. This is a project which has tirelessly been supported by UN Women and by various civil society organizations. This process has 6 regional fora, and 4 have already happened, and a major national forum with women from throughout the country, as well as various territorial and sectoral forums with indigenous women, LGBT women, women signing up to the peace process, and women who are victims from the diaspora. Thirdly, the peace agreement establishes clear, measurable commitments which seek not only to integrate the gender perspective in building peace, but also to comprehensively tackle violence against women in all its forms, as well as developing specific strategies which seek to ensure emotional recovery for the victims of sexual violence and their psychosocial rehabilitation, in particular for victims of sexual violence. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace also took the fundamental decision to open up a macro case to specifically tackle sexual violence and gender-based violence during the armed conflict. Fourthly, we have committed to the proposals and activities of the International Alliance on the Prevention of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Within this context, we have established security policies with a preventive approach and with capacity building areas for public servants and civil society. I should like to conclude by stressing that the full guarantee of human security, which is happening through our total peace policy in Colombia, is based on the basic premise that victims and survivors must be at the heart of all our efforts. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Colombia for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria aligns itself with the statements made on behalf of the EU and the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security. We commend the United Kingdom for its efforts to organize the annual open debate on conflict-related sexual violence, and thank SRSG Pramila Patten for presenting the annual report of the Secretary General. Let me also thank the civil society briefers for sharing their perspectives. Over the past 15 years, the Security Council has established a robust framework of applicable international norms addressing CRSV, based on the condemnation of sexual violence as a tool of war and the recognition that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. However, both the annual report and today's briefers paint a dismal picture with regard to the compliance with these standards. Rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion and forced sterilization, forced marriage, and other abhorrent forms of sexual violence continue to be used in situations linked to conflict throughout the world, including as a systematic tactic of war. While women and girls are the primary targets, it is important to recognize that men, boys, and persons with diverse gender identities are also affected. Sexual and gender-based violence is unacceptable in any circumstance, and it is particularly despicable when used in a widespread targeted manner, which dramatically affects not only the immediate victims, but also their entire families, communities, as well as generations to come. Austria is appalled by the report's findings of persisting and even worsening patterns of sexual violence in many different contexts, including in DRC, Ethiopia, Haiti, and South Sudan. We deplore the use of sexual and gender-based violence against civilians and prisoners of war as a result of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war on Ukraine, which has been documented extensively by the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine based in Vienna. Austria also remains deeply concerned about the situation in Afghanistan, where the Taliban de facto authorities have effectively erased women and girls from public life. We strongly condemn all forms of CRSV and join the Secretary General's call upon all parties to conflict to immediately cease such crimes, comply with relevant Security Council resolutions, and allow unhindered access to United Nations teams. In particular, we call upon the Russian Federation, all listed parties, and other perpetrators to make and implement specific time-bound commitments to combat sexual violence in line with their international obligations and the recommendations of the report. The most effective way to prevent CRSV is through strong compliance with the rule of law, which is also an indispensable precondition for sustainable peace and security. Therefore, we commend the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict for continuing to assist national authorities in over a dozen countries in strengthening rule of law institutions to enhance accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. Each state is responsible for ensuring accountability as well as access to justice for victims of CRSV. It is crucial to ensure that perpetrators are swiftly tried and held accountable. In this regard, we reiterate our full support to the International Criminal Court and to United Nations mandated commissions of inquiry. Moreover, we wish to remind member states of their obligation in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2467 to apply a survivor-centered approach and provide access to medical and psychosocial care. Mr. President, Austria applauds SRSG Pramila Patten for all her efforts to fulfill her mandate by working with member states and armed groups to comply with international law, international humanitarian law, human rights, and international norms. We also commend UN Women, whom we strongly support, including in Ukraine and Afghanistan, as well as UNFPA. We have also renewed our support to the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women and Girls this year. The immeasurable contributions of civil society organizations, in particular of women's and women-led organizations in preventing and responding to CRSV, also deserve to be emphasized. We stand in solidarity with all victims of CRSV and their families. Accordingly, we urge the members of the Security Council to take bolder actions, including the use of sanctions, in order to address CRSV and ultimately to stop blatant breaches of international law, resolve conflicts, and find solutions towards achieving sustainable peace and security. As a staunch supporter of Resolution 1325, adopted by this Council 23 years ago, and in view of the discussions on a new agenda for peace, Austria calls upon all Security Council members to collectively recommit to reinvigorating the Women, Peace and Security agenda and instilling new life into its implementation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Austria for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Yes, Mr. President, Greece would like to thank warmly the United Kingdom for organizing today's timely event and the distinguished speakers for the thorough intervention, in particular the special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence and conflict, Mrs. Patten, for her presence. While fully aligning myself with the statements made by the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, allow me to make some additional remarks under our national capacity. Despite systematic efforts by the UN system to strengthen the normative framework on conflict-related sexual violence, the latest report of the Secretary General clearly illustrates the gap between standards and commitments and the devastating reality on the ground. In many conflict environments, the parties to the conflict, state or non-state actors, continue to deploy the strategic use of CRSV against civilians, mostly women and girls, but also men and boys, as well as against members of the LGBTQI+ communities. The alarming frequency of CRSV and the prevailing impunity for those crimes, which is the norm rather than the exceptions, indicate rather low levels of compliance by states with the UN normative framework. Against this backdrop, there is undeniably an urgent need for holistic and coherent international policy action. In this vein, international response to CRSV should be inclusive and survival-centered, addressing the specific needs of different groups of survivors, focusing on the protection, relief and recovery, and therefore ensuring their full and meaningful participation in peace and transitional justice processes. At the same time, accountability of the perpetrators should be adequately addressed by facilitating the prosecution through appropriate judicial mechanisms and by ensuring unhindered judicial access and gender-responsive reparations for victims. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence is a horrific crime with devastating consequences for civilians, their families and the communities at large, a threat to security, and an impediment to the restoration of peace. In this regard, Greece supports a human-centered and gender-responsive approach to peace and security, which focuses primarily on the protection of civilians in conflict settings, especially women and children, girls and boys. This is reflected also in the priorities of the Greek candidacy for an elected member of the UN Security Council for 2025-2026, which include the promotion of the intellect agendas on A, the protection of civilians, B, women, peace and security, and C, children and armed conflict. In this vein, I would like to reiterate my country's determination to join hands with all like-minded stakeholders in order to accelerate prevention of and response to any form of CRSV, as the only way to build a peaceful, resilient, inclusive, and gender-equal societies. I thank you so much.
I thank the representative of Greece for their statements. Colleagues, we still have 40 speakers left to go, so I do encourage you to hit the 3-minute target, as our Greek colleague just did. So on that note, I give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Thank you. Mr. President, at the outset, my delegation would like to express our appreciation to the United Kingdom for convening this important debate. Malaysia would also like to thank the briefers for their update and assessment. I'll try to be brief. Mr. President, Malaysia condemns the abhorrent use of sexual violence as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism. We're gravely concerned with the reported heightened risk of sexual violence against civilians, particularly on women and children in conflict. The recent report by the UN Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence presents disturbing findings on patterns of sexual violence that persisted and further deepened in conflict situations. Against this background, we are dismayed by the prevalent impunity with perpetrators quite regularly absconding from accountability. Mr. President, efforts to address sexual violence in conflict situations should employ an integrated and holistic approach by all important stakeholders, including states, the whole UN system, and civil societies. It is critical for countries in conflict and post-conflict to take adequate and necessary measures to prevent and respond to CRSV. In this regard, my delegation wishes to highlight the following points. First, it is incumbent upon states to introduce or strengthen legislation and judicial processes to document, investigate, and prosecute sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations. Importantly, the state's duty to ensure accountability must be embedded in both domestic and international laws. All states have the obligation to prohibit CRSV and prosecute the perpetrators. We also call for provisions concerning CRSV to be integrated into the negotiations and agreements to the peace process. Second, we see merits in broadening networking and coordination between the Security Council and the Human Rights Council towards ensuring accountability for violations, including sexual assault and violence against women and children. Third, meaningful participation of women in prevention efforts, including peacekeeping and peace building, needs to be prioritized. Women's role as agents of change in the security framework can advance citizens' trust in the institutions and contribute towards improving intelligence gathering, reporting of gender-based violence, and treatment of victims, witnesses, and suspects. At the same time, we need to end the harassment and reprisal targeting women in peace and security process. Mr. President, Malaysia remains committed to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the collective efforts to combat CRSV, including through the UN peacekeeping operations. Since 2014, the Malaysian Peacekeeping Center has continued to teach courses on gender as well as the role of women in peacekeeping missions. The elimination of conflict-related sexual violence is our collective moral duty. Let me conclude by stressing the importance for the Security Council to urgently work with relevant stakeholders and partners in our efforts to strengthen the protection of civilians, including women and children in conflict situations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malaysia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, the delegation of Sierra Leone is pleased to join this global discourse on the theme sexual violence, promoting implementation of Security Council resolutions on conflict-related violence. I congratulate you for assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of July 2023, and also thank you for convening this timely debate. Mr. President, having experienced one of the bloodiest and fiercest civil wars during which sexual violence, including rape, sexual slavery, forced marriage, etc., were used as tactics of war by the warring factions, Sierra Leone is fully aware of the horrifying impact of these crimes on the lives and livelihoods of its women and girls, and it's sparing no effort at combating this scourge. Mr. President, there is no gainsaying that many commendable actions have been taken by both the General Assembly and the Council in the forms of treaties, conventions, and resolutions, including Resolution 1820 in 2008. Yet, women and children around the world remain vulnerable to sexual violence, be it in times of war or peace. There is still much to be done at the national, sub-regional, regional, and global levels if we are to fully implement landmark resolutions 1325, 1820, and other relevant human rights instruments in our grand effort to turn the tide against sexual violence in all its forms and manifestations. Mr. President, building on our domestic efforts, His Excellency President Bio, in his speech at the UN General Assembly in September 2021, called for global solidarity on access to justice, remedies, and assistance for survivors of sexual violence in the form of a stand-alone resolution, which was adopted by consensus by the General Assembly on the 2nd of September 2022. This resolution does not only highlight the gravity of sexual violence, but specifically calls out the crimes as abhorrent to international peace and security and will uplift survivors who deserve dignity and justice. I encourage all member states to implement the directives of the content of this resolution, as most of its elements speak to the issue of accountability and prevention. Peace, in our view, is not the absence of visible conflict, and that in order to have true peace, survivors must have access to justice. Mr. President, let me close by appealing to the delegations here present to deeply reflect upon the fact that, notwithstanding the many stringent measures adopted individually as well as collectively, the despicable crime of conflict-related violence, especially sexual violence, has continued unabated around the world, and many a time with total impunity. The time to accelerate effort is now, and there is the urgent need for concerted and concrete steps to be taken to address the incidences of sexual violence crimes, restore the dignity of survivors, such as promoting forwarding strategies and strengthening accountability as prevention through enforcing compliance with the relevant normative positions that we have all adopted. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you. Mr. President, we thank the UK for organizing today's debate. Slovenia aligns itself with the statements delivered by the European Union, the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and the Group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect. We welcome the Secretary General's annual report and its presentation. Slovenia condemns in the most absolute terms the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war or as an instrument of repression and intimidation, and calls for the full implementation of the commitments to end it. Focusing on the prevention of sexual violence in situations directly or indirectly linked to a conflict, we would underline the following 3 points. First, impunity encourages the continued commission of these crimes, as evident by the fact that a sizable majority of the same perpetrators appear in these reports year after year. Support for and investment in strong justice systems and rule of law institutions are necessary to prosecute and punish the perpetrators and those responsible. To this end, Slovenia would also support the listing of sexual violence as a standalone criterion for targeted sanctions by the relevant sanctions committees. Second, we need to resolutely address barriers to reporting, monitoring, and documenting this crime. We see as vital in this regard humanitarian access, the accelerated deployment of women's protection advisors in all relevant situations of concern, in line with Security Council Resolution 2467. Provision of comprehensive and tailored support to survivors of sexual violence and children born of such violence, and close work with the affected communities to address the stigma, socioeconomic isolation, and fear of retaliation. Third, we need to encourage and facilitate the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in humanitarian, recovery, political, peace, security, and development processes. This is also essential to the availability and safeguarding of gender-based violence services. To conclude, Slovenia underlines its enduring support for the work and mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence. Slovenia will continue to work with partners such as UN Women, ICRC, UNFPA, and Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund to address the needs of survivors of sexual violence in conflict and support the work of human rights defenders and activists on this matter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the UK presidency for organizing this important debate and Special Representative Pramila Patten for her insightful briefing. I am especially grateful to briefers Ms. Hser and Ms. Nadine for sharing their testimonies and practical recommendations with us today. My delegation aligns itself with the statements by the European Union and on behalf of the group of friends of Women, Peace and Security, and we would also like to make a few points in our national capacity. The report presented reveals a distressing reality. Both state and non-state armed groups extensively employ conflict-related sexual violence, targeting civilians through rape, gang rape, and abductions. These findings yet again demonstrate that the Russian Federation persistently uses sexual violence as a weapon of war against Ukraine. Prosecutors and investigators have documented 212 cases of such crimes, including 13 cases involving children, 12 girls and 1 boy. These atrocities span across a wide age range, from the youngest victim at the tender age of 4 to the oldest survivor of 87. The UN has reported sexual violence as a form of torture and inhuman treatment against civilians and prisoners of war. It is crucial to recognize that these numbers only represent cases where survivors were able and willing to testify, suggesting that the actual figures are way much higher. Ukraine remains committed to replacing impunity with the justice and transforming indifference into action. The experiences, needs, and demands of survivors are at the heart of our efforts. We commend the efforts of Special Representative Patten and her team, who have provided substantial assistance to the government of Ukraine in achieving these goals. Last year, we signed a framework of cooperation with the UN to respond to and prevent CRSV, becoming the first country to establish an all-encompassing coordination mechanism for combating CRSV. Shortly after that, Ukraine adopted a detailed implementation plan involving state institutions, civil society, and international organizations. In partnership with UNFPA, we opened 11 survivors' relief centers across the country to provide victims with access to various services. To structure and ensure the effectiveness of this cooperation, we established the Interagency Working Group, focusing on 5 key areas: access to justice and accountability, comprehensive assistance to CRSV survivors, strengthening the security and defense sector to prevent CRSV, combating trafficking in persons for sexual exploitation, and reparations and compensations. Another crucial step is gaining political commitments and leading the international legal battle for justice. Ukraine joined the International Alliance on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative launched by the United Kingdom and proudly became a vice chair. We firmly believe that solid cooperation between governments, multilateral partners, civil society, and survivors is a crucial prerequisite for breaking the cycle of impunity. Our collective response must be resolute, unwavering, and decisive. There can be no tolerance for those responsible for inflicting mass suffering upon the most vulnerable and defenseless. All perpetrators must face the highest consequences for their crimes. In this regard, criminal accountability holds the utmost importance. However, above all, the international community must consolidate efforts to exert maximum pressure on Russia to end its brutal war of aggression, its war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. The truth is there, the evidence is there, and the punishment shall come. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the European Union, on behalf of the Group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect, as well as on behalf of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. Please allow me to make some additional remarks in my national capacity. The report, which was presented here today, provides an appalling picture of the global situation regarding conflict-related sexual violence. It describes a deep crisis of impunity and an unacceptable rule of lawlessness. Sexualized violence is deliberately being used as a tactic of war, as a means of torture, and of political repression by states and non-state parties, such as armed groups and mercenaries. It leaves societies traumatized for decades. It is a hindrance to reconciliation and goes unpunished too often. We have to ensure accountability by effectively prosecuting perpetrators. This is why we strongly support the mandate and work of SRSG Patten, her team of experts, and the UN Action to End CRSV. We support regularly inviting SRSG Patten to brief sanctions committees. We call on all states to join us in imposing restrictive measures against perpetrators of sexualized violence in conflict. Mr. President, how can we prevent CRSV from happening in the first place? Wars and armed attacks must be prevented at all costs. Furthermore, we have to level power imbalances that disadvantage women economically and politically, and we have to combat misogyny and gender stereotypes that enable gender-based violence. While the fight against structural root causes for CRSV is a long-term endeavor, I would like to point out essential measures that can protect and support survivors and victims in the short term. Recent reports suggest that there is a strong link between increased militarization and the proliferation of weapons on the one hand, and the occurrence of sexual violence in conflict on the other hand. Member states must therefore establish effective arms and ammunition control regimes. We also need to deploy more gender advisors in peace operations and special political missions. Moreover, member states need to provide accessible sexual and reproductive health services, as well as psychological and legal support and reparations. Last but not least, we have to match words with actions and provide predictable and reliable funding to combat CRSV. Germany strongly supports the mandate of SRSG Patten and the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. This year, we contributed with a project budget of €1 million for their important work. Since 2023, we've been the lead of the call to action on protection from gender-based violence in emergencies, aiming at systematically improving prevention and mitigation of gender-based violence. We will continue to be strongly engaged. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank you for convening this critical debate today on this necessary yet disturbing topic. We thank the Special Representative, Ms. Pramila Patten, and other briefers from the field for their insights shared with us today. South Africa associates itself with the statement delivered by Canada on behalf of the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence as an occurrence is shameful, but its continued use as a weapon of war is especially heinous. It is grave violation of international human rights law and international criminal law, and it is important that the international community takes a strong stance on this. It is distressing to note that the victims and survivors of such violence are often persons who already experience systemic discrimination or persecution. In particular, women and girls are targeted for rape, gang rape, and abductions, causing personal harm, social disruption, and prolonged socioeconomic consequences, which extend beyond the end of direct violence. The report of the Secretary General reminds us that people are often targeted on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity, and we will encourage greater recognition of this reality in the resolution of this august body. Mr. President, the report of the Secretary General highlights the strong linkage between instability or weakened governance and the increase in sexual violence. Poor rule of law and weakened state authority results in increased sexual violence as non-state actors conduct themselves without any concern or accountability. We must seek measures to act against such atrocity crimes and crimes against humanity. This should be done through prevention, protection, and the provision of support to victims and/or survivors. We thus recognize the value of women's protection advisors in the field and encourage the continued use of this endorsed service and priority. Unfortunately, we are disheartened by the limited resources allocated for such personnel and strongly advocate for an increased allocation, including through measures called for in Security Council Resolution 2467 of 2019. Mr. President, it is important to recognize that most state actors that are listed in the report have made formal commitments to adopt measures to address conflict-related sexual violence. So we must work together to support these state actors in their efforts. Yet it is non-state actors that are particularly prone to the use of sexual violence as a weapon, and the existence of such actors is directly connected to instability and weakened governance. We therefore continue to advocate for increased support to state actors and actions that address instability, including unconstitutional changes of government, which is also highlighted in the SG's report. In conclusion, South Africa remains committed in its efforts to address this terrible crime. Our work and focus must seek to prevent these crimes, support victims and survivors, and hold perpetrators accountable. We encourage the continued work on this issue by the Security Council and remain committed to support its ongoing efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of South Africa for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and then, of course, my own country, Denmark. I want to begin by thanking first and foremost our distinguished briefers for their sobering statements, and not least, your vital work in this field. Colleagues, throughout 2022, sexual violence continued to be used as a tactic of war, as an instrument of intimidation, and as a way to dehumanize and destroy communities and the lives of civilians. In countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Libya, Myanmar, and South Sudan. We are deeply alarmed by the reports of persisting and deepening patterns of sexual violence by both state and non-state actors. In Ukraine, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry have documented and reported sexual violence as a form of torture and inhumane treatment against civilians and prisoners of war. The violence is perpetrated overwhelmingly by Russian military personnel. Let us not mince words. Conflict-related sexual violence is a clear violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. And as the Secretary General has pointed out time and again, impunity for acts of conflict-related sexual violence remains the norm. This needs to be addressed. This needs to change. Conflict-related sexual violence can and must be prevented and countered. It is within the power and responsibility of member states to make that happen. It is the responsibility of this Council to act. To this end, the Nordic countries would like to emphasize the following. First, member states must investigate all cases, prosecute perpetrators through appropriate judicial mechanisms, and guarantee access to justice for victims and survivors. Second, our humanitarian response to conflict-related sexual violence must be gender transformative and put survivors' needs front and center. This could be through cash programming, sexual and reproductive health services such as access to emergency contraception and safe and timely abortion care, as well as mental health and psychosocial support. And third, all sanctions regimes must explicitly include sexual and gender-based violence as a designation criterion. Security Council Sanctions Committee should list perpetrators when there is repeated evidence of conflict-related sexual violence, including as put forward annually in the annex of the Secretary General's report. And lastly, the capacity and skills to act on conflict-related sexual violence and to refer different types of victims to appropriate service providers must be built across peace operations, not just among women peacekeepers. The notion that women are inherently better at or specifically responsible for responding to conflict-related sexual violence both perpetuates the idea that their primary added value is related to their gender and reflects a narrow understanding of the survivors and perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence. Excellencies, protection is the bedrock for women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in political, social, and economic processes, which is in turn critical to ending conflict-related sexual violence and preventing its recurrence. We can therefore no longer watch survivors being sidelined from security policy. And we, the Nordics, will continue to work in collaboration with all partners, including security stakeholders and institutions, civil society, and women-led and feminist organizations, not least at the local level, to push back on any attempt to hinder the full, equal, and meaningful participation of all women. Let me conclude by underlining that the Nordics continue to stand firm on zero tolerance for any reprisals against women human rights defenders and fully support their advocacy for gender equality and defending human rights. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Italy.
I would like to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this annual open debate, as well as the special representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, and the distinguished representatives of the civil society for their briefings. Italy aligns itself with the statements of the European Union, of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and the Group of Friends of Responsibility to Protect, and would like to add the following remarks in its national capacity. Mr. Chair, this year we celebrate the 15th anniversary of the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 1820 that has established conflict-related sexual violence as a self-standing security issue. Since then, the UN have built up a more robust normative framework to address this issue, in particular by establishing the mandate of the Special Representative. We reiterate our strong support for the mandate and the work of the Office of the SRSG Patten and the team of experts. Yet, we face a disturbing reality where conflicts increase by frequency, scope, and intensity. Sexual violence, slavery, and exploitation proliferate also in the context of internal and cross-border displacement, protracted displacement, abduction, and trafficking. The respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law is being challenged to an unprecedented extent. We express our deep concern for the blurring of distinction of the responsibilities between state and non-state actors, highlighted in the SG report, which complicates the attribution for the heinous crimes and undermines accountability. We condemned the use of sexual violence as deliberated warfare tactic, and we joined the call of the members of the Group of Friends of WPS to urge the Security Council to use all tools at its disposal to support effective action against conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence as a weapon of war. We also recognize the important role of the International Criminal Court in investigating and prosecuting sexual violence within the context of armed conflicts in accordance with its mandate under the Rome Statute and relevant Security Council resolution. Mr. Chair, as the Secretary General writes in his report, harnessing the preventing power of the rule of law is essential, and this is indeed the time for action. All the risk factors that contribute to make sexual violence in conflict a largely underreported crime must be addressed in a comprehensive way if we want to actually break the circle of impunity. On the one hand, we must act on prevention to disrupt the gender inequality entrenched in harmful social norms and practices. On the other, we must act on response to remove the multiple barriers that hinder access to services, to reporting, and to formal justice. We must invest in programs and policies aimed at ensuring that assistance is accessible and safe for victims and survivors, free from fear of social stigma, intimidation, and reprisal. We must invest in gender-responsive security and justice sector reforms. We must ensure that these same principles be embedded in the training of military personnel deployed at national level, as well as in the UN peacekeeping and special political missions. Mr. Chair, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda provides a crucial framework for the collective action of the Council. We commend the work of women's civil society organizations, who are often at the front line of war and conflicts, providing relief and protection, and contributing to build and consolidate community resilience. We reiterate the importance of supporting safe spaces for effective women participation in the framework of a credible and sustainable national action plans on WPS. We call on the international community to reaffirm in this context the commitment to address the root causes of conflict and the structural gender inequalities and barriers hindering the full enjoyment of rights by all women and girls in all spheres of public and political life. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Thank you, President. Chile thanks the United Kingdom for convening this open debate, and we note the contributions and briefings we've heard. We also align ourselves with the intervention by the Group of Friends for the Responsibility to Protect and the Group of Friends for Women, Peace and Security. President, Chile condemns sexual violence in armed conflict. This type of sexual and gender-based violence is used as a tactic of war in a systematic and reiterated way, and it represents a serious violation of human rights and constitutes a war crime. This Security Council has rightly recognised that sexual violence can exacerbate and significantly prolong armed conflict situations and can hinder the re-establishment of peace. Such behaviour cannot be normalised or accepted as a collateral of war or of internal crisis situations. President, for this and many other reasons, we deem it indispensable to include in the training of armed forces a greater integration of the gender perspective on a permanent basis, including measures to prevent sexual violence, as well as for troops who participate in peace missions. Likewise, Chile supports the initiative Action for Peace of the Secretary-General, and which requires appropriate conduct by all personnel of the organisation in missions, supporting the United Nations zero-tolerance policy with a victim-centred approach with regard to all forms of sexual abuse and exploitation. Chile notes with concern that there are still many situations of sexual violence during armed conflict which have not been investigated or prosecuted, which could have a deterrent or preventive effect. The international community must therefore react by helping these countries to shore up their justice system, always with the view of turning to international tribunals as a possibility, such as the International Criminal Court. Chile reiterates its commitment to those international instruments which punish acts of sexual violence as war crimes, such as the Statute of the International Criminal Court and the Geneva Conventions on Humanitarian Law. Likewise, implementing the resolutions of this Council is an imperative to bring an end to the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Resolution 1820 of 2008 was an important step in recognising this violence, and the subsequent resolutions attest to the fact that this is a permanent concern of this Council. Resolution 1960 of 2010 also establishes a system of accountability to bring an end to the sexual violence associated to conflict situations, which has worsened in recent years. In this regard, Chile supports the designation of selective sanctions applied by the respective Security Council committees against those who are involved in the commission of sexual violence crimes, whether as the perpetrators or the brains behind them. It is therefore important to provide multidisciplinary, timely and non-discriminatory assistance, which allows victims to fully reintegrate into their communities and contribute to peace building. This is fundamental to promote, protect and guarantee access for the victims of sexual violence to adequate health services, allowing for the rehabilitation of survivors. Finally, there must be a commitment on the part of the whole international community to support the efforts of post-conflict countries to incorporate the question of sexual violence in armed conflict as a specific topic in transitional justice, promoting appropriate legal mechanisms to receive complaints and carry out criminal investigations. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Chile for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Uruguay.
Señor Presidente.
President, at the outset I wish to thank the United Kingdom as presidency in the Council this July for convening this open debate on a particularly relevant topic, conflict-related sexual violence, and linking this to promoting the relevant Security Council resolutions. We also are grateful for the presence of Ms. Pramila Patten this morning, Special Representative of the Secretary-General on Sexual Violence in Armed Conflict, and the representatives of civil society organizations who briefed us this morning. Sexual violence in armed conflict is brutal, deliberate, and intends to punish and/or humiliate people and their communities. It is often motivated by political, military, or economic reasons to control territory and resources. Often it is perpetrated in the context of abuse of civilians who are often targeted because of their real or perceived belonging to a particular ethnic, religious group, or their gender identity or sexual orientation, as I say, real or perceived. The International Criminal Court and its statute include violation and other types of sexual violence in the list of war crimes, and the list of acts which constitute crimes against humanity when they're committed as part of a general systematic attack against civilians. Resolution 1820, adopted by the Security Council by consensus and by its 15 members, recognises the fact that sexual violence can constitute international crimes, such as crimes against humanity, torture, or be an act which constitutes genocide. This Council has continued to reiterate its concern regarding the continued acts of violence against women and girls in situations of conflict through various resolutions, including 2466 of 2019. Despite the existence of a broad normative and legal framework on sexual violence and gender-based violence, the report of the Secretary-General on sexual violence in conflict continues to note numerous situations, including cases of Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Iraq, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. In its recommendations to the Security Council, the Secretary-General requests that all parties to conflicts be urged to bring an end to all forms of sexual violence related to conflict. President, Uruguay believes that this recommendation is fundamental, but also insufficient if it is not accompanied, in particular, by the recommendations of the report of the Secretary-General, paragraph 75. 75G on early warning, and H on consultations on the ground, particularly with organizations led by women. Against this backdrop, firstly, it is essential that there be guarantees that sexual violence is the subject of systematic follow-up and is part of the criteria of independent designation for the imposition of selective sanctions, so as to deter all parties, including mercenaries and military organizations and private security organizations, from committing this kind of violence. We believe that the severity of this act is so relevant that it must be combated. Secondly, we echo the recommendation of considering the possibility of the Council referring to the International Criminal Court such situations where sexual violence has been committed, as defined in its statute. The certainty of accountability for such crimes, as I was previously saying, which are so brutal and deliberate, must be ever more present in their minds if it is to be properly combated. Thank you very much.
Uruguay for their statements. Colleagues, I remind you to try to stick to the 3-minute limit. We still have 30 speakers to go. Now, I give the floor to the representative of Botswana.
Mr. President, I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the group of friends of the responsibility to protect, consisting of 55 member states and the European Union, and this year co-chaired by Botswana, Costa Rica, and Croatia. The group would like to thank the United Kingdom for organizing today's important open debate and the briefers for their insightful remarks. This year marks the 15th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1820. Despite the progress made to implement this important resolution, sexual violence remains pervasive in conflicts today, impacting thousands of persons every year, in particular women and children. The 2022 Secretary General's annual report identifies 17 countries in which CRSV is being perpetrated. We can only assume this is the tip of the iceberg, as sexual violence remains severely underreported. It is therefore urgent that we devise strategies to collectively address and prevent CRSV and uphold on our responsibility to protect. And we must reject the perception that sexual and gender-based violence is an inevitable product of war. Mr. President, as it is primary responsibility of member states to protect their populations against atrocity crimes, including where those atrocities involve rape and other forms of sexual violence, the group of friends of the responsibility to protect would like to stress the following points. Firstly, strengthening the capacity of national institutions is critical to ensuring accountability and to preventing and deterring such crimes in the future. The connection between conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence and discrimination against women and girls in times of peace is very clear. In this regard, it is of utmost importance that the states put in place and enforce legislative and institutional processes to comprehensively address all forms of sexual violence and gender-based violence, including sexual in peacetime as well as during conflict. Ensuring states are aware of their obligations and responsibilities to address conflict-related violence under international law is essential if we are to close the implementation gap. Secondly, where national institutions are not able or willing to take action against perpetrators of sexual violence, the international community should act to ensure accountability for such crimes. For example, the UN Security Council has shown that it can use targeted sanctions against those who perpetrate and direct sexual violence in armed conflict, and we encourage it to take further such action. Thirdly, there is an urgent need for a survivor-centered, trauma-informed approaches to support the needs of victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence during and after situations of conflict, including the needs of the children born from sexual violence in conflict. Lastly, Mr. President, at the heart of sexual and gender-based violence lies a disregard for human rights, as well as a perpetuation of systematic gender inequality, asymmetric power structures, and pervasive discrimination. Sexual violence in conflict must be addressed with full, equal, and meaningful leadership of women, including women's rights and civil society organizations, in the establishment of prevention mechanism. This also requires the inclusion of survivors and affected communities in identifying holistic solutions that address their needs. It is equally important to continue to engage men and community leaders to play a positive role in combating sexual violence and addressing gender stereotypes and the exclusion of women and girls. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Botswana for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. President, I wish to express our deep gratitude to the United Kingdom for having convened this important debate. I should also like to recognise the leadership and the work of Ms. Pramila Patten and her office, and my gratitude to the other briefers for their valuable contributions. Thank you for shedding light on the harsh realities of conflict-related sexual violence. President, with 2,455 United Nations verified cases and many other cases which remain hidden, it is clear that sexual violence continues to be a perverse and devastating scourge in conflicts. 94% of these victims are women and girls, and the vast majority of those are girls. It is a bleak perspective which has worsened in various conflict situations. It is used as a tactic of terror, torture, intimidation, and political repression, as a merciless tool for forced displacement and dehumanization of innocent and vulnerable people. The consequences of this violence are deep and lasting for the victims. They suffer not only physically and psychologically, but also socially. Often they are stigmatized and isolated and weighed down by a deep trauma. In the face of this urgent situation, it is imperative that we tackle conflict-related sexual violence with an unswerving determination and with collective action. A comprehensive approach is needed, which encompasses prevention, protection, justice, support for survivors, and establishing legal frameworks which criminalize such acts and guarantee that perpetrators are held accountable. Accountability must be the fundamental pillar in combating sexual violence related to conflict, thus bringing an end to impunity. It is also fundamental to focus on the needs and rights of women and girls, and to tirelessly persevere in the fight for gender equality and full respect for and enjoyment of their human rights. International law establishes the obligations upon states and parties to conflict to prevent, investigate, and sanction such heinous acts. In this regard, it is vital that this Council's resolution, which tackle this topic, be fully implemented, so as to guarantee accountability and serve justice for victims. Allow me to home in, President, on the worrisome situation in Haiti. The Secretary-General's report confirms alarming levels of sexual violence related to conflict in this country. Criminal gangs have used this violence as a weapon of war to punish and terrorize whole communities. The adoption of Resolution 2653, which creates a sanctions committee and a panel of experts, this has been an important step to monitor and tackle this regrettable situation, and we hope that the upcoming report of the Secretary-General will provide more encouraging data following the efforts of the Haitian authorities and the commitment of the parties to fulfill their obligations. I must underscore the fact that the renewal of BNU's mandate under Resolution 2692 of this Council today has been another important step. This resolution establishes that the Human Rights Unit of the Office will be endowed with specific capacity to tackle sexual and gender-based violence, including the identification of women's protection advisors. The situation in Haiti also recalls how important it is to work towards eliminating the illegal trafficking of weapons and ammunition in combating violence against women and girls. President, it is fundamental to empower local communities and to involve men and boys as allies in this fight, to achieve inclusive and sustainable change. Bringing an end to this horrendous crime is down to all of us, including our collective responsibility to restore dignity to all the victims and survivors. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Dominican Republic, and I give the floor to the representative of Luxembourg.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I thank the United Kingdom for having organized this public debate as part of its presidency. We also extend our gratitude to the Special Representative, Pramila Patten, and her team, as well as to the two civil society representatives for their recommendations. Luxembourg fully endorses the statement made by the European Union and those of the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security, and on the responsibility to protect. Allow me to add a few considerations in my national capacity. The fundamental human rights of survivors, such as the rights to dignity, privacy, health, safety, access to justice, truth, and effective remedy, are at the heart of the feminist foreign policy of Luxembourg. Thus, my country has just signed on to the Murad Code and joined the newly formed Alliance on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. We are grateful to the United Kingdom for spearheading these initiatives, and we encourage all member states to join them. Luxembourg also continues to support the Stand, Speak, Rise Up initiative, the UNFPA, UN Women, and Justice Rapid Response, as well as the mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Mr. President, despite the numerous resolutions adopted by the Security Council since 2008, sexual violence persists and continues to be used as a weapon of war in Mali, in Myanmar, in the DRC, in Sudan and South Sudan, and Syria, and other conflicts. As the Secretary General points out in his report, the number of actors involved is multiplying. In Ukraine, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has documented 109 cases of sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian military. The age of the victims ranged from 4 to 82 years old. Here, too, it is possible to speak of the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. In order to put an end to the cycles of sexual violence, Luxembourg would like to make 4 recommendations. First, the fight against impunity must be at the center of our efforts. A key role here belongs to the International Criminal Court. Sexual violence in conflict is a war crime and could constitute a crime against humanity or the crime of genocide. We support the work currently underway on a Convention on Crimes Against Humanity. Secondly, through investigative mechanisms, we must support the work of documenting the crimes committed. Third, close cooperation with civil society must be ensured, and we must protect these key partners against reprisals by taking appropriate measures. Fourth, and finally, we must address the root causes of sexual violence and redouble prevention efforts. This means not only ending the culture of impunity, but also recognizing that sexual violence is linked to gender inequality. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Luxembourg for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Belgium subscribes to the statements by the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. We'd like to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate, Special Representative Patten for her remarks, and we explicitly thank the civil society briefers for their powerful and insightful contributions. Participation by civil society allows us to take into consideration the experience of those impacted. Everything we say and do should fully take into account the needs and perspectives of the survivors of these abhorrent crimes. By doing so, it is clear that access to justice, as well as sexual and reproductive health, rights and services, should be an integral part of UN and national responses to CRSV. For survivors of CRSV, this means inter alia access to treatment for internal physical injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, emergency contraception, safe abortion, and pre- and postnatal care. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, today's presentations and the Secretary General's report are quite disconcerting, particularly when it comes to the extremely low levels of compliance, including by states. There is an urgent need to bridge this gap. And when we talk about implementation, this also implies enforcement and combating impunity. My government supports this effort inter alia by financing the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict, which cooperates with the authorities of Ukraine and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, among others. We welcome their commitment, encourage them and others to continue this effort, and ask other states to consider supporting the team of experts.
While acknowledging that preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence is the primary responsibility of states, Belgium stresses the need to explore how CRSV can be connected to sanctions policy and practices. For instance, by considering a more systematic input of information from the Office of the Special Representative of the Sanctioned Committees of this Council. Mr. President, finally, we should recognize that conflict-related sexual violence is rooted in structural gender inequality and harmful social norms. Belgium couldn't agree more with the Secretary General's recommendations to tackle the root causes of CRSV by promoting women's and girls' leadership, by creating an enabling environment for women and girls active in public life, and by stepping up to protect women politicians from violence and reprisals. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Belgium for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Mr. President, on behalf of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia, I extend my gratitude to the United Kingdom for organizing this open debate and to the distinguished briefers for their presentations. Mr. President, as we reflect upon the previous year, we see that sexual violence persisted as a cruel weapon of war, torture, and terrorism in various regions, including in Myanmar, Syria, Libya, and Iran, where it was employed to intimidate and punish political opponents. Displaced women and girls in Mozambique, the DRC, Somalia, and Sudan fell victim to sexual assault by armed individuals in and around displacement sites. The Baltic states commend the UN's tireless efforts in addressing these horrific situations. We appreciate the work of the UN Interagency Network, Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, for the initiatives providing crucial support to survivors, including medical, psychological, legal, and socio-economic assistance. A notable example in this project implemented in the conflict-free mining sites in the DRC. We also express our appreciation to the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict for their contributions in strengthening the rule of law institutions. Their efforts, including assisting Ghanaian authorities in establishing an ad hoc tribunal, deserve recognition. Mr. President, unfortunately, conflict-related sexual violence is also part of the full-scale war of aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Since February 24 of last year, the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine documented 125 cases of conflict-related sexual violence affecting civilians and prisoners of war, while a real number is even higher. These heinous acts committed by the Russian armed forces and groups as a tactic of war, including torture methods such as electrocution, beatings, burns, forced nudity, and rape, including gang rape. The victims ranged from young children to the elderly, with perpetrators even raping women and girls in front of their family members. Moreover, Russia's attacks on hospitals hindered access to services for managing the aftermath of the sexual violence. It is horrendous that a permanent member of this esteemed council is responsible for these crimes and continues to commit atrocities on a daily basis. Furthermore, the Russian Federation seeks to stifle the United Nations voice and action through its veto powers. Yet the international community refuses to be silenced. The General Assembly recognized the need to hold the Russian Federation accountable and to establish an international mechanism for reparations. This May, the Register of Damage under the Council of Europe was established, signifying steps towards justice for Ukraine. We look forward to the Ministers of Justice meeting of the Council of Europe in Riga, Latvia in September to continue implementing the Register of Damage. In conclusion, we express our appreciation for the Special Representative's tireless work. We assure of our unwavering support for her and for anyone dedicated to preventing sexual violence, assisting survivors, and assuring accountability for the perpetrators both in Ukraine and elsewhere. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's open debate. And I also thank the briefers, SRSG Patten, and the representative of civil society for sharing the realities of sexual violence in conflicts. My delegation aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and also the statements delivered on behalf of the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security and Responsibility to Protect. Allow me to share some national perspectives. 75 years since the establishment of the United Nations, the adoptions of its charter, and of the Universal Human Rights Declaration, one thing remains clear. A world without human rights is a world without peace. This year's Secretary General's report identified 17 countries in which CRSV is deployed as a strategy in conflict by terrorist and non-state armed groups, but also by state authorities. Unfortunately, in almost all settings covered in the report, impunity persists, undermining peace processes and reconstruction efforts. Our national pledge to implement the provisions of the UN Security Council's resolution on combating abuse and sexual exploitation in conflict are mostly visible in two areas. On the one hand, we have invested in training our armed forces, including those participating in peacekeeping activities, on the prohibition of all forms of sexual violence against civilians. On the other hand, the active presence of Romania as co-chair of the WPS Focal Point Network reconfirms our commitment for advancing the global women, peace and security agenda that also includes CRSV. We will make sure that this topic will be diligently addressed at the ministerial meeting of the WPS Focal Points later this September. Mr. President, the Secretary General's report raises awareness on the increased risks of trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation in Ukraine's vicinity following the large-scale displacements triggered by the war of aggression started by Russia. Allow me to assure you that the Romanian authorities, along with partners from civil society and the private sector, work tirelessly to circumvent this phenomenon. Among the measures put in place by Romania to prevent the risks associated with human trafficking for refugees from Ukraine, I would like to mention a mechanism for early identification of victims, the setup of a national emergency fund for victims, a dedicated working group for preventing sexual exploitation, and the funding of NGOs for delivering survivor-centered support, including access to psychosocial, healthcare, and legal services. We invested all these efforts because we consider that ending the climate of impunity is the way forward to prevent a response to CRSV. Likewise, we believe that accountability measures should be adopted and implemented at national level, and international accountability mechanisms should be in place. The stories of survivors of sexual violence, mostly women and girls, like the ones we heard this morning, need to be told, but most importantly, needs to be heard so that action can follow. As government representatives, we need to create the conditions so that conflict-related sexual violence does not remain underreported or be one of the least condemned crimes. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Romania for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Thank you very much. Spain aligned itself with a statement by the European Union, the group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, to which we belong. The Security Council has recognized that the best way of protecting civilians against sexual violence in conflict, and particularly women and girls, is prevention and deterrence, so that sexual violence is no longer used as a weapon of war. It has also established punitive measures against perpetrators and reparation for survivors, which must be guaranteed to prevent impunity. However, the reality is that impunity is the general rule when it comes to accountability. Impunity prevails. When cases against perpetrators are not successful in the first instance, or else when extrajudicial solutions are adopted, which do not fall within international norms of justice and reparation for victims. Spain believes that the best way of preventing sexual violence in conflict is to work towards gender equality, towards the promotion and protection of human rights, and towards the full, significant and effective participation of women in their societies. Moreover, prevention works better when women and women's organizations themselves participate in their development, implementation and monitoring, and when they receive the necessary resources to carry out this work. Therefore, as states, we must commit to predictable and sustained financing to the Multi-Party Trust Fund. Another effective way of combating impunity is to urgently send experts in sexual violence in conflict and gender violence to investigate cases and create safe environments in transit and destination countries of victims. Evidence generation is fundamental to continue to advance in this field. Likewise, it is fundamental that peace operations perfect and broaden the protection mandates. It is important for the response to this violence to be centered on the victims and survivors with a comprehensive approach which includes access to health services, including sexual and reproductive health, mental and psychosocial health, as well as legal support and livelihood or income generation projects. In this regard, we welcome the fact that the UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict has adopted this approach. President, the third National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security in Spain will focus in particular on women in Ukraine. It will include measures to guarantee investigations into the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war and the protection of victims, as well as the significant participation of women in peace building and reconstruction in Ukraine. Along with the Netherlands, Spain organizes the course on a comprehensive gender approach in operations. This is delivered 4 times a year, and one of its aims is to equip both military and civilian personnel with practical ways of interacting with local men and women. Additionally, Spain will, in the upcoming months, organize a series of meetings to combat sexual violence in conflict in the context of our presidency of the Council of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Spain for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Portugal aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security, and categorically condemns the use of sexual and gender-based violence by state and non-state actors in situations of humanitarian crisis and conflict-affected settings. We welcome the convening of this debate, which is particularly significant in the light of the concerning trends emphasized by the Secretary-General's report. The widespread pattern of sexual violence it depicts shows how pressing is the work and mandate of Special Representative Pramila Patten, whose briefing I thank. One of the alarming trends highlighted in the report is the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war by non-state armed groups to consolidate control over territories or exploit lucrative natural resources in certain countries. Furthermore, the increasing proliferation of mercenary groups has also led to a rise in violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law. Conflict-related sexual violence continues to cause massive displacements, both internally and across borders. The refugee crisis stemming from the war in Ukraine has led to a rampant risk of women trafficking for sexual exploitation. In this regard, we welcome the establishing of a comprehensive interagency working group to address sexual violence, which focus on anti-trafficking measures. As armed conflicts escalate and their devastating consequences unfold, disproportionately affecting women and children, we cannot remain idle. These abhorrent crimes must be punished and the perpetrators brought to justice. The Security Council has already adopted a comprehensive framework to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence. We call on all states to ensure its implementation in national legislation and make clear efforts to combat sexual and gender-based violence, safeguard women's rights during times of conflict, provide redress for survivors, and ensure accountability for perpetrators. But combating conflict-related sexual violence is also a shared responsibility that rests with all of us gathered here today. The Security Council can make significant advances by designating conflict-related sexual violence as a criterion in all relevant UN-sanctioned regimes. The UN and Member States can also bolster accountability efforts and increase compliance with international legal framework by assisting other Member States to harmonize domestic laws with international standards, providing support to justice systems, both military and civilian. In order for this to happen, states must cooperate in these efforts in every level, embracing a genuine desire to promote equality in the realization of civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights between women and men, dismantling discriminatory social norms and gender stereotypes, and work on prevention. This is the only way to ensure the end of sexual and gender-based violence in any setting, while also fostering sustainable peace and political and social stability, which should be the main driver of all of our actions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Portugal for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statements made by the European Union, the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and the Group of Friends on R2P. And let me thank you and the UK for organizing today's debate and for keeping conflict-related sexual violence on the agenda of the Council. And we also like to thank SRSG Patten for her briefing this morning and reiterate our full support for her mandate. We are very grateful for the important work that the SRSG and her staff are doing despite difficult circumstances. Allow me to also extend my special gratitude to today's civil society's briefers. We'd like to thank you for your courage to break the cycle of silence and stigma around CRSV. And your experience and contributions, as well as those of other CSOs and survivors, should guide our efforts to prevent and address CRSV. As we heard from the presentations and the debate today, levels of sexual violence are increasing. Horrific reports, including from Sudan and Ukraine, have illustrated its severe and lasting impact on individuals, communities and societies. And sadly, the statistics in the report on CRSV are only the tip of the iceberg. We urgently need more and better data in order to fully capture the scale of this problem and to better tailor our responses. So urgent and joined-up efforts are needed to improve the availability and harmonization of data across the system, while of course ensuring safety and confidentiality. I would briefly like to mention 3 areas for action today. First, we need to eliminate harmful social norms and gender stereotypes that perpetuate or justify conflict-related sexual violence and address its root causes. This is something that cannot be done overnight, but good practices already exist. For example, in South Sudan, the Netherlands supports a project that promotes discussions on positive masculinity and works with religious and local leaders to adequately address gender-based violence. And we should look at sharing and scaling up those best practices. Second, as also mentioned by Ms. Na this morning, we need to protect those in the most vulnerable positions, including women human rights defenders. 2023 marks 25 years since the adoption of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, so it should feel a special responsibility to support these courageous women and be clear that any form of violence or intimidation or any attempt to limit their space to speak up is unacceptable. And finally, it's important to adopt a holistic approach to national and international accountability. Justice should not be seen as limited to criminal proceedings. We should respect the choices of victims and survivors when it comes to their path to healing, recovering, and finding justice, and make sure that their choices inform our policies and programs. And a final point on accountability. When states are unwilling or unable to act, thematic sanctions can serve as a last resort, as shown by the initiative by the Netherlands in collaboration with Germany and France for EU sanctions for acts of violence against women. Mr. President, with our feminist foreign policy, the Kingdom of the Netherlands stands firmly for the right to a dignified life free from violence for all. We are committed to work with all stakeholders for concrete action and progress, to take preventative action and to better the lives of those affected by CRSV. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Netherlands for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, my delegation would like to express its appreciation to the UK for convening today's open debate on this important matter. We would also like to convey our gratitude to all the briefers, including SRSG on sexual violence in conflict, Pramila Patten, and extend a warm welcome to this year's report by the Secretary General. The Republic of Korea aligns itself with the statement delivered by Canada on behalf of the Group of Friends of WPS, as well as the statement delivered by Botswana on behalf of the Group of Friends of R2P. I would I would now like to deliver the following statement in our national capacity. Since the unanimously adopted Security Council Resolution 1820 in 2008 on conflict-related sexual violence, CRSV, the Council has renewed and strengthened its commitment to eliminating CRSV through several related resolutions in the years that followed. The key promise that these resolutions made was to prevent and eradicate such crimes. Nevertheless, it is distressing to note that the latest report from the Secretary General documented over 2,000 cases of CRSV again, including in the DRC, South Sudan, and Ukraine, with little significant reduction observed over the past decade. In particular, the Republic of Korea is deeply concerned about pervasive impunity for CRSV, which not only discourages the victims from reporting from the crimes, but also instills fear of reprisals or the recurrence of violence. Impunity must not become the norm, and the CRSV should not be seen as an inevitable consequence of conflict. While ensuring accountability at both the local and national levels is crucial, my delegation also supports the Security Council's efforts to incorporate sexual and gender-based violence as a designation criterion for UN sanctions regimes. Targeted UN sanctions against those who perpetrate and direct sexual violence in conflict can address impunity as well as serve as a deterrent. The Republic of Korea would also like to emphasize the importance of a survivor-centered approach in addressing CRSV, as outlined in Security Council Resolution 2467. Heeding the voices of survivors and responding to their needs are essential to provide relevant support and help them reintegrate into communities. In this regard, the Republic of Korea takes pride in its continued contributions to the Global Survivors Fund since its inception. As one of the main donors for the fund, we have promoted its activities around the globe, which include providing the survivors with financial compensation, vocational training, and medical and psychological care. Last but not least, it is critical that survivors do not remain mere victims of the violence, but are transformed into agents of peace. To achieve this, we need to make our utmost effort to ensure the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women at all stages of the peace process. The Republic of Korea has created an international forum called Action with Women and Peace since 2018. At the 5th conference later this year, we look forward to hearing from more women, including survivors. Mr. President, as an elected member of the Security Council for the term 2024 to 25, the Republic of Korea looks forward to contributing to the Council's noble work of preventing CRSV and ensuring justice for all those affected. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Korea for their statements. Colleagues, we still have 20 speakers left to go, so I encourage you to stick to the limit of 3 minutes in your statements. Thank you very much. I give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and of the group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect and wishes to add some additional remarks in its national capacity. We would like to start by thanking the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate on women, peace and security with focus on conflict-related sexual violence. We would also like to thank SRSG Patten as well as representatives of the civil society for their briefing. We seize this opportunity to express our deep concern that despite systematic advancement of the women, peace and security agenda, the heinous practice of sexual violence in conflict is still present and widespread. This was marked by the Secretary General in its latest report. We fully agree with the Secretary General that enhanced investment by the international community to break the vicious cycle of sexual violence and impunity is urgently needed. SRSG Patten also recently clearly stated that, quote, Yet despite increased international awareness, the global trend lines of conflict-related sexual violence are worsening. End of quote. We consider it crucial to foster an enabling environment for victims and survivors and to provide them with accessible and quality multisectoral assistance. This includes all 17 conflict-affected countries as described in the report, including Afghanistan, DRC, Myanmar, Syria, or Sudan. Mr. President, as the co-chair of the Group of Friends of Security Sector Reform, Slovakia wishes to recall United Nations Security Council Resolution 2151 on SSR, which underscored the importance of women's equal, meaningful, and effective participation and full involvement in the security sector in order to build inclusive, accountable, and legitimate institutions that more effectively protect populations and promote lasting peace and sustainable development. Gender-responsive security sector reform is key to developing security sector institutions that are non-discriminatory, representatives, and capable of effectively responding to the specific security needs of diverse groups. It is critical to ensure that gender equality and women's empowerment are not sidelined and that funding for WPS agenda is carefully allocated. I wish to underline that the Security Council mandates should explicitly recognize women's contribution to SSR processes and more clearly encourage peace operations to support women's meaningful participation and leadership in all stages of SSR processes. Mr. President, one of the questions that emerged from the concept note of today's open debate is how the Security Council responds to states that fail to hold perpetrators to account. This is a highly relevant query as one permanent member of the Security Council has blatantly violated the international law and principles of the UN Charter. The situation of many Ukrainian citizens has turned into living hell since the Russian Federation decided to start its senseless war of choice. The ongoing, unjustified, and unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine has resulted in serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including sexual violence. This constitutes not only a despicable act, but it can also qualify as a war crime or crime against humanity. We wish to stress once again that all perpetrators must be brought to justice and held accountable for crimes committed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me at the outset thank the UK Presidency, and in particular His Excellency Lord Ahmad, Minister of State and Special Representative of the Prime Minister on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, for convening this open debate on this vital aspect of international peace and security. We thank SRSG Patten and other briefers for the information provided today. Mr. President, despite the Security Council's efforts since the adoption of Resolution 1820, there seems to be no end in sight for the growing number of victims of conflict-related sexual violence. The Secretary General's report has documented 2,455 cases of conflict-related sexual violence in 2022. These are only a small proportion of this underreported crime. The report lists 49 parties, including states and non-state actors, responsible for such crimes. However, the credibility of the report is seriously eroded because of what looks like a deliberate decision not to report the crimes of sexual violence being committed in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and in Israeli-occupied Palestine. There is ample documented evidence that since 1989, Indian occupation forces have used rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war in occupied Kashmir. Thousands of women and girls have been raped and gang raped and subjected to enforced incarceration, torture, and abduction. The infamous incident of Konun Pushpura is raw in the memories of all Kashmiris. Thousands of women and girls, boys and men, have been detained and subjected to sexual violence and torture as punishment and humiliation. Entire communities, women, girls, and boys, are prevented from their rights, including freedom of expression in religion, education, and employment. This is corroborated by the two reports of 2018 and 2019 issued by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is also corroborated by the international media and human rights organizations. And since India's unilateral and illegal measures of 5 August 2019, conflict-related violence and harassment and humiliation of women and girls in Kashmir has increased significantly. We would therefore urge the Secretary General to rectify the report submissions and include information on the incidence of sexual violence in foreign occupied Kashmir and Palestine, and list India and Israel amongst those parties perpetrating conflict-related sexual violence in future reports to the Security Council. Mr. President, this open debate is a somber reminder of the need to take decisive action. We would urge all Security Council resolutions related to protracted conflicts should be faithfully implemented. The implementation of this issue should cover all 4 pillars of the WPS agenda. The gaps in oversight and investigation mechanisms should be addressed to end the culture of impunity. And finally, the provision of timely assistance, health services, rehabilitation, and reintegration in response to sexual violence in conflicts should be strengthened and adequately funded. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we would like to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate. We thank as well SRSG on sexual violence and conflict, Mrs. Pramila Patten, and the other briefers for their statements earlier today. Mr. President, we still remember SRSG Patten's words during last year's debate on ending cycles of sexual violence and conflict, when she stated, and I quote, "Women's rights are not Western rights, they are human rights," end of quote. We as Lebanon, a country that has played a role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that we are celebrating its 75th anniversary this year, strongly concurs with her. Mr. President, when we read the latest report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, where it is stated that impunity remains the norm, we ask ourselves, how many times are we going to keep on saying this? Survivor and Nobel Peace Prize Nadia Murad's word can bring some key answers to our questions. And I quote her, "Sometimes I feel as if I'm repeating myself over and over again, but the messages remain important. I will keep saying them until we solve the issues." End of quote. Mr. President, the devastating use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, a humiliating and degrading one, continues unabated, with women and girls being mainly the victim. without forgetting that men and boys can also be the target of sexual violence and conflict. Human beings' bodies are not and should never be considered a tool of combat. Mr. President, we commend the United Kingdom's leadership in preventing sexual violence and conflict. Lebanon participated in the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict Initiative International Conference that took place in London in November of last year and endorsed as well the Political Declaration on Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. Mr. President, one of the strongest pieces of the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York is the statue of Lucretia by French sculptor Philippe Bertrand from the early 18th century. The sculpture depicts Lucretia committing suicide out of shame for her rape. No victim, no survivor of sexual violence should ever have to go through this extra layer of pain and suffering. Our common duty is to understand what they have gone through, to support and empower them, and to prevent such atrocities to be committed ever again. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Lebanon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Mr. President, Kazakhstan thanks the UK presidency for convening today's open debate. We commend the Special Representative Patten for the insights drawn from Secretary General's annual report. We also thank our civil societies briefers for their passionate plea to us and horrifying analysis of this scourge in different parts of the world. Kazakhstan endorses the recommendation of the Secretary General's annual report. Despite the robust normative framework and the progress achieved, we need to collectively reflect on how to reduce conflict-related sexual violence. At the same time, we must take measures to ensure that sexual violence is not used as a tactic of war or aggravated by human trafficking, which can become a source of income by terrorist organizations and transnational organized crime networks. We also need to address new emerging threats from the largely ungoverned digital space. This scourge requires concerted and well-coordinated cross-national interventions with the one UN approach. There is also a need for improved coordination between UN entities, regional and sub-regional organizations, and civil society in prevention, assistance to victims, research advocacy, information sharing, capacity building, and exchange of good practices in combating sexual violence. Enhanced implementation of armed control and disarmament measures can contribute to both long-term structural prevention and short-term operational prevention of sexual violence in conflict. Our deliberations today make it clear that the international community should ensure accountability for sexual violence and conflict and bring a resolute end to impunity. Conflict-related sexual violence affects every aspect of survivor's life and leads to the stigmatization of victims and devastation of physical and economic security, especially of displaced and rural women. We therefore need a survivor-centered approach, which should include full, competent, and speedy attention for the victims, with increased access to health care, psychosocial support, legal assistance, and socio-economic reintegration. Cooperation with religious leaders, civil society, and local communities is most important to exchange extremist narratives, shift the stigma of sexual violence to the perpetrators, promote education, and increase awareness of the empowerment of women. Kazakhstan strongly believes that preventing sexual exploitation and abuse by the peacekeepers should be an absolute priority with the UN zero-tolerance policy for such offenses. All troops and police contingents should have full training prior and during deployment. We support the greater recruitment of well-qualified women military and police officers and the deployment of women's protection advisors to the peacekeeping missions. Our country integrates all elements of the WPS agenda, including on conflict-related sexual violence, in our national legislation with the new strong pro-women policies. Training on gender equality for the armed and security forces and women's deployment in UN peacekeeping operations a priority for Kazakhstan at KASCENT, our national peacekeeping training center. At the regional level, we are supporting Afghanistan with multidimensional approach of conflict prevention and resolution, recovery, reintegration, accompanied by humanitarian and development assistance through strengthening the security and development nexus. At the international level, we are contributing to the UN Trust Fund to end violence against women that funds projects in the post-conflict settings. To conclude, I reiterate Kazakhstan's strong commitment to fully implement the WPS agenda and promote women's dignity and gender empowerment. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellency, distinguished delegate. First, my delegation would like to thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's debates on conflict-related sexual violence, promoting the implementation of Security Council resolution on conflict-related sexual violence. We highly appreciate the Secretary General timely report on CRSV and the effort of UN action against sexual violence in conflict. May I also thank all the briefer and speakers before me for sharing their insight on the topic. We all know that it is difficult to reduce conflict-related sexual violence when there are so many active conflict and instability around the world. The trend of using sexual violence against women and girls as a means of terror and retribution is alarming. Thus, I cannot agree more with Ms. Pramila Patten, the Secretary General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, the view that more action are needed. Mr. President, please allow me to highlight a few points. First, on prevention. Member states should prioritize working together on the prevention of conflict and the escalation of existing conflicts. It is important to strengthen national legislation to ensure accountability for sexual crimes committed by members of the armed force. Education and training with the involvement of women and victims should be mainstreamed within the armed forces, including those deployed as part of the international peacekeeping mission. Second, on victim support, members of the armed forces should also be part of the efforts to assist victim recovery and integration. More women, especially those from the armed forces, should be encouraged to get involved in this endeavor. Third, enhancing accountability is the most difficult issue. Ideally, state and non-state actors condoning sexual abuses or weaponizing them for attrition or retribution should be made accountable. However, the challenges lie in the process being politicized, the question of victim safety, and the needs for victim-centered approaches. In conclusion, Cambodia strongly condemns all forms of sexual violence and calls for end to all conflicts. We believe that conflict and instability are major factors that contribute to sexual violence, and the peace and stability are essential to preventing this crime. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Cambodia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Mr. President, our gratitude to the United Kingdom for convening an open debate in the Security Council on conflict-related sexual violence. We also express our appreciation to SRSG, Pramila Patten, and all the distinguished briefers for their valuable contribution and insightful perspectives. Sexual violence and armed conflicts perpetrated by state and non-state actors poses grave security challenges, and it is indeed disconcerting that sexual violence continues amidst a thriving culture of impunity in armed conflicts. Over the past decade, the Security Council has put in place a strong framework to combat this menace, but the level of compliance by parties to the conflict remains alarmingly low. We feel that the Council must absolutely focus on identifying and bridging the implementation gaps to prevent such atrocities and facilitate the rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors. Allow me to make 6 proposals very quickly. 1. National governments have the primary responsibility for prosecuting and deterring such crimes in conflict situations in their territories, even if these are alleged to have been committed by non-state actors. 2. Member states should ensure effective prosecution of sexual violence as a standalone crime. There must be no impunity for the perpetrators, and states should ensure accountability in line with their international obligations and in line with their duty to uphold the rule of law. 3. The UN, upon request, must assist national authorities in conflict areas in developing capabilities to strengthen their national investigative and legal frameworks and related structures for speedy investigation and prosecution of perpetrators. 4. As survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are not a homogeneous group, countries must adopt a tailored, victim-centered approach to preventing and responding to sexual violence in armed conflicts, in line with Security Council Resolution 2467 that calls for strengthening justice and accountability and for a survivor-centered approach in the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. 5. States must ensure adequate focus and resources for comprehensive and non-discriminatory assistance for victims of sexual violence by providing for inter alia, medical, psychological, social, and legal services. And 6, sexual violence primarily directed against women and girls and also against men and boys by terrorists remains a cause of concern. The nexus between terrorism, trafficking, and sexual violence in armed conflicts needs to be broken. Going forward, Mr. President, we would recommend that a greater participation of women in conflict resolution and post-conflict reconciliation processes should be promoted to address deep-rooted inequality and subordination in society. It is important to make this a precondition for any peace process to succeed. As well, mainstreaming of the gender perspective in peace operations and increasing the representation of women in peacekeeping are prerequisites for prevention and response. In this vein, India welcomes the UN's uniformed gender parity strategy to increase the number of women peacekeepers. We also support increasing the deployment of women protection advisors for effective monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on sexual violence in armed conflict. The experience of India's deployment of an all-women police contingent in Liberia illustrates the enormous positive impact that deployment of women peacekeepers can have on the effective participation of women in civilian and political life in a post-conflict situation. We would also add, and in order to promote synergy and effective coordination, that it is important to avoid duplication in the working of various UN organs. The issue of violence against women, including sexual violence, is discussed by other UN bodies, including at the Human Rights Council. Deliberations at the Security Council, therefore, should remain focused on such atrocities perpetrated in situations of armed conflict, threatening international peace and security. In conclusion, Mr. President, I strongly reaffirm India's unwavering commitment to actively contribute to our collective efforts in effectively addressing sexual violence in situations of armed conflict. Lastly, I would like to address the frivolous remarks made by a representative from another delegation concerning my country. I will not dwell on this for long, but I feel it necessary to dismiss such remarks with the contempt they deserve. A country that fails to safeguard the rights of its women and girls, allowing forced religious conversions and tolerating sexual and gender-based violence, has no credibility to pass judgment on any other nation, least of all my own. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
شكرا. السيد الرئيس، اسمحوا لي في البداية أن أشكركم على عقد هذا
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we would like to thank you for having organized this meeting. We also thank Ms. Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General, and the other briefers. Mr. President, the Yemeni government attaches great importance to women's issues. Very early on, the government committed to developing a national plan on women, peace, and security pursuant to Resolution 1325, and based on the 4 pillars: protection, participation, protection, and recovery. A special committee was established to this end in collaboration with governmental partners, including the National Commission for Women, law enforcement agencies, as well as civil society organizations, academia, and the private sector. The Ministry for Social Affairs and Labor organizes and oversees a national team tasked with implementing this plan, as well as the activities that are part of this plan. Mr. President, sexual violence is a horrific and heinous violation of human rights. It undermines the achievement of the SDGs in the 2030 agenda relating to gender equality, reducing inequality, and access to justice, which requires building effective and accountable institutions at all levels. Mr. President, my delegation has taken note of the Secretary General's report on conflict-related sexual violence. We thank Ms. Patten for her efforts. Yemen has made the choice of peace, and it takes part in regional and other efforts, as well as the efforts of the Special Representative of the Secretary General. We affirm that the traditions and customs of Yemeni society prohibits any infringement or violation of the dignity of Yemeni women. The national law criminalizes sexual or physical assault against women. Mr. President, Houthi militia continues to violate human rights law, committing violations against women and girls, and undermining their political and social rights. The incidents mentioned in national reports, as well as other human rights bodies and the group of experts on Yemen, in particular the 2022 report, as well as the report of the Secretary General of this year, highlight a number of violations. These include discrimination, marginalization of women. Houthi militias have imposed strict restrictions on Yemeni women in areas where they control. There's a restriction on their freedom of movement, including prohibition on traveling abroad without a chaperone, a male chaperone. There are some very severe practices that have been introduced, such as gender-based segregation in schools and government institutions. Women are deprived of quality education, the right to work outside the home, to participate in public life and social life. Secondly, sexual violence. Many cases of sexual assault and abuse have been documented, committed by the Houthi militia in territories under their control in order to terrorize the population. This is a flagrant violation of international law. By way of example, I can cite the arbitrary detention of Intisar al-Hamadi and others. These women were detained and then tried unfairly by Houthi militias. They were accused of indecent acts and possession of narcotics and condemned to 5 years of prison. Secondly, arbitrary detention. Militias are detaining women without any legal basis with fallacious accusations. They are then held in secret prisons in inhumane conditions, and this due to their political, media, or other activities. Fourth, violations of fundamental freedoms. These women cannot enjoy freedom of expression. There are defamation campaigns targeting the reputation and work of women's rights defenders. Mr. President, Resolution 2564 of 2021 on the sanctions regime on Yemen imposed sanctions on the Houthi leader Sultan Zabin, and this was due to the systematic campaign of arrest, torture, sexual violence, and rape carried out by the Criminal Investigation Department in areas controlled by the Houthi militia. This resolution shows the international community's determination in addressing these practices of sexual violence in territories under the control of the Houthis. These resolutions contribute to helping women, but it is important to continue targeting Houthi leaders that are guilty of such practices so that they are held accountable and so that justice can be served. Too many activist women continue to languish in prison and continue to experience torture, sexual violence, and other exactions. Finally, Mr. President, is it necessary to strengthen international cooperation to combat conflict-related sexual violence? This needs to be done through exchange of information, expertise, as well as technical and financial support, in particular to countries that are suffering from conflict or are in the post-conflict phase. In this regard, we thank all of our regional and international partners, in particular the government of Norway, that has supported Yemen in the implementation and follow-up of its national plan on women, peace, and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Yemen for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President, and thank you to our briefers today. We take this opportunity to reiterate our steadfast commitment to Special Representative Patten and to the work of her office, which is so indispensable in shining a light on what is so often obscured. I commend the contribution of our civil society briefers today, whose bravery is remarkable. You remind us that our approach to these most heinous of crimes must always be survivor-centred and prioritise your needs, perspectives and aspirations. Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union, as well as the groups of friends of women, peace and security, and the responsibility to protect. As the Secretary-General has outlined in his report, 2022 has exposed civilians to heightened levels of sexual and gender-based violence against the backdrop of shrinking civil society space and collapsing rule of law in conflict settings. Across the globe, whether in DRC, Haiti, Myanmar, Ukraine or elsewhere, sexual and gender-based violence continues to be brandished as a weapon and tactic of war, and impunity regrettably remains the norm. First and foremost, we repeat the call on all parties to conflict to immediately cease all forms of conflict-related sexual violence. Furthermore, all states must commit to a zero-tolerance policy for crimes of sexual and gender-based violence in line with their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. This has been set out in numerous Security Council resolutions since the adoption of Resolution 1820 in 2008. Yet while our commitment to eliminating all forms of conflict-related sexual violence remains resolute on paper, translating this to reality remains a challenge. Civilians on the ground, mostly women and girls, continue to suffer, including in new and emerging manifestations, whether that be online, through the acts of mercenaries and private military companies, or in gang warfare. Where acts of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict are ignored or even emboldened, this scourge will persist. Access to justice for survivors and accountability for perpetrators is absolutely essential. Though we have seen some encouraging developments in strengthening rule of law institutions and national legislations on protection and reparations, there remains much more to do in this space. In that regard, we welcome the recent launch of the Guidebook on State Obligations on Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. President, where national efforts fail, the international community has a duty to step up, and in particular this Council. 8 sanctions regimes of this Council include conflict-related sexual violence within their designation criteria. We believe this should be a prerequisite across all regimes, and that the Council should continue to designate individuals who are specifically responsible for acts of sexual and gender-based violence, as done recently in Haiti and Yemen. The Council and its subsidiary bodies should continue close collaboration with the Special Representative and her office and give due consideration to a dedicated field visit on the topic of CRSV. Critically, resource and budgetary commitments to deploying women protection advisors to UN missions and offices should match the political commitment we heard around this table today. Otherwise, we simply pay lip service to what is a serious threat not just to individual security, but to international peace and security. Finally, President, we wish to recognise the outstanding work undertaken by women-led organisations at the coalface dealing with conflict-related sexual violence. These organisations provide meaningful and sometimes life-saving support to survivors in the absence of more lasting solutions, often facing reprisals of their own. We encourage Member States to keep such organisations to the forefront of considerations in all humanitarian and development funding and efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Presidency of the United Kingdom for organizing this important open debate. I also thank Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and other briefers for their comprehensive and insightful remarks. Bangladesh aligns itself with the statement made by Canada on behalf of the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security, and with the statement delivered by Botswana on behalf of Group of Friends on Responsibility to Protect. Mr. President, we had the horrific experience of sexual violence in conflict during our liberation war in 1971. More than 200,000 of our mothers and sisters were violated during this war. However, in a war-ravaged country with a lot of limitations, our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, took immediate action to meet the urgent need of the victims and established a rehabilitation board for relief and reconstruction of war-affected women. The board arranged rehabilitation of the victims, including remedial measures to address physical and psychological trauma. Besides the victim support approach, most of the perpetrators of the sexual violence have been brought to justice through a trial process. The contribution of victims in our independence has also been recognized officially. In line with our commitment to prevent and stop sexual violence in conflict, we have always been an ardent advocate and supporter of WPS agenda. We proudly recall the Security Council adopted the historic and landmark Resolution 1325 on WPS in 2000, when Bangladesh was a member of the Council and played an important role to advance the issue. Regrettably, years later, we had to witness the worst form of sexual violence against the Rohingyas in our neighboring Myanmar. We have been providing all critical support to those 1.2 million Rohingyas who have taken shelter in Bangladesh. SRSG Pramila Patten has also visited the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar and heard firsthand from the victims. We have been repeatedly urging the Myanmar authorities to ensure their safe, voluntary, and sustainable return. Unfortunately, it's been more than 6 years. No progress has been made for repatriation. Not a single Rohingya has returned due to lack of conducive conditions in Myanmar. I refer to the Secretary General's call to allow immediate and unconstrained access to United Nations mandated investigatory and reporting bodies to humanitarian actors for providing support to affected populations. At the same time, we would like to see the perpetrators of sexual violence are held accountable in Myanmar. Mr. President, it is unfortunate that sexual violence continued to be used as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism. The Secretary General's latest report mentioned that in most contexts, impunity remained the norm, while emerging threats in the largely ungoverned digital space and the combination of climate insecurity, state fragility, and structural gender inequality further exposed women and girls to conflict-related sexual violence. In this context, allow me to highlight a few points. First, state has the primary responsibility to prevent and respond to the conflict-related sexual violence. In this connection, it is imperative to ensure capacity building of the state to effectively address the root causes as well as to meet the needs of victims in order to bring them into normal life. National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security can also play a critical role in the efforts of member states to address sexual violence in conflict. Second, we urge to take necessary steps in addressing the gender-based digital divide. Gender-based hate speech and incitement to violence are fueling the conflict in many places. At the same time, victims are disproportionately affected by the lack of access to digital tools and resources, hindering their access to life-saving security and public health information and networks, among others. Third, while we are condemning that impunity for conflict-related sexual violence remain the norm, we need to ensure accountability through ensuring gender-sensitive and efficient security and judicial sector and strengthening legal framework and justice mechanisms in national context. The Security Council needs to use its mandate and authority when national justice mechanism is unable to deliver. Fourth, We highlight the role of UN peacekeepers in providing life-saving services as well as psychological support to the victims of conflict-related sexual violence in various war-ravaged zones. In this regard, we refer to the recommendation of the Secretary General to include dedicated operational provisions on gender-responsive security and justice sector reform to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence in mandate authorizations and renewals of peace operations, as well as in transition plans. We also underscore the importance of deployment of women's protection advisors to peace operations. Fifth, we call for greater coordination and complementarity among the UN mechanisms, especially in the field under the reinvigorated RC system, to complement Council's work to address the conflict-related sexual violence. We also call for greater synergies between the mandated UN entities and the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Finally, we underscore the role of the Peacebuilding Commission to help implementing the Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2467 of 2019 through its advices. The Peacebuilding Commission's advice can bring the voice of women briefers and women organizations to the Security Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bangladesh for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Morocco.
Mr. President, my delegation would like to begin by thanking the United Kingdom for organizing this debate on an issue of the utmost importance, namely the elimination of sexual violence in times of conflict. I would also like to particularly thank the representatives of civil society who shared their very moving testimonies with us. The Secretary General's annual report of June 2023 shows that history is unfortunately repeating itself with ever new lamentable cases of sexual violence, rape, and torture. This is a picture of unacceptable savagery and brutality, illustrating a chronicle of sexual violence and conflict. Over the past decade, there has been an important paradigm shift, and progress has been made, thanks in particular to the mandate of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, as well as the relevant resolutions of the Security Council, which followed Resolution 1325. Today, sexual violence in armed conflict and post-conflict situations is considered a threat to international peace and security. However, given the persistence of these heinous acts, indignation is no longer enough. We must strengthen our joint action and propose true, pragmatic, and above all, lasting solutions in order to prevent and punish acts of sexual violence and help survivors to rebuild and fully reintegrate into their communities while preserving their rights and their dignity. In this regard, allow me to highlight the following points. First, the international community would benefit from taking a more comprehensive and holistic approach that prevents conflicts and addresses their root causes. Conflict prevention is a central pillar of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, as well as the 2030 Agenda, whose SDGs, in particular Goals 5 and 16, place great emphasis on conflict prevention and demonstrate that women's issues, peace, security, and development are interlinked, interconnected, and inseparable. Secondly, women must be included in decision-making, in particular by promoting and encouraging national initiatives aimed at ending gender-based discrimination. It is also crucial to support women's participation in debates on conflict resolution, the maintenance of peace and security, and post-conflict rebuilding, peace building. Thirdly, we must fight against impunity, instill a policy of zero tolerance, and ensure access to justice for the victims. At the same time, the stigma that surrounds victims of sexual violence and children born of this violence must be eliminated because it constitutes a repeat victimization. Survivors must receive medical support and help with their social and economic reintegration. Finally, religious leaders have an influential role to play in fighting the abuse of religion to justify gender-based violence and discrimination. They must be encouraged to speak out firmly against these horrific crimes. In addition, local actors and community leaders play a crucial role as they can identify warning signs of acts of sexual violence, offer early warning systems, and propose appropriate prevention strategies. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Morocco strongly condemns all forms of sexual violence, including in times of conflict, and considers them to be barbaric, brutal, and inhumane methods and practices with serious consequences for the process of establishing lasting peace and reconciliation. Convinced of the contribution of women as crucial early warning mechanisms, as well as their awareness of threats to local security and their role in mediation, Morocco participates actively in a number of initiatives, in particular the initiative on the promotion of mediation in the Mediterranean, the network of focal points on women, peace and security, and the Mediterranean Women's Network. Since the establishment of the Royal Armed Forces in 1956 and the early integration of female personnel into this institution, the gradual inclusion of women within the Royal Armed Forces has been steadily rising. Indeed, His Majesty King Mohammed VI, Supreme Commander and General Chief of Staff of the Royal Armed Forces, has given his authorization for female personnel to participate in competitive examinations for admittance to military schools on the same footing as their male counterparts. Thus, today, Moroccan female military personnel are represented both within the National Defense Administration as well as in all the components of the Royal Armed Force, Land, Air, Navy, and the Royal Gendarmerie. They're also present in UN peacekeeping missions, both in the DRC as well as in the Central African Republic, where Moroccan contingents are deployed. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Morocco for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General for her briefing this morning. Taking note of the report of the Secretary General, we would like to convey our thanks to the Office of the SRSG for the participatory working methods and consultations that allowed us to react to the draft report prior to its finalization. It's, however, regrettable, despite our engagement, the report does not incorporate our inputs and serious concerns. I therefore would like to put on record our strong reservations about the scope and content of the report dealing with Ethiopia and the reference to the International Commission of Human Rights expert on Ethiopia. We do not recognize this commission and any of its substandard work. We thus caution the SRSG from using such devious sources. In the last 2 years, Ethiopia was faced with extraordinary security challenges. But the government of Ethiopia has, despite the challenges, made concerted efforts to ensure respect and protect the rights of women in vulnerable situations. Unhindered humanitarian aid has been expedited to all people in need of assistance. The implementation of the November 2022 peace agreement has enabled the further provision of humanitarian aid, the restoration of services, and the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants are underway. We have also charted a clear path for accountability for alleged human rights violations. On women's rights, we followed a four-tiered approach that encompassed accountability and victim support. One of these avenues is the Interministerial Task Force, the IMTF, that is implementing the recommendations of the Joint Investigation Report of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights. Secondly, we have the military justice system that is ensuring accountability within its own mechanisms. In this process, we have pending and closed prosecutions against suspected perpetrators of alleged crimes against women. The third such avenue is the regular law enforcement mechanisms that are coordinated with the IMTF on the persecution of suspects and the provision of remedies for victims. The fourth tier consists of the works of the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs of Ethiopia leads cross-sectional initiatives to provide rehabilitation and comprehensive support for victims. All these processes will further be consolidated in the mechanisms to be established under the Transitional Justice Policy. The options for this Transitional Justice Policy are being discussed in nationwide consultations. It is expected for the policy will take its final form in August and implementation to start in September. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights are providing technical assistance to ensure these consultations conform to international standards. Reconstruction and recovery programs have also given adequate place for sectors such as health, education, and economic sectors that have a special focus on women. We also have intensified our efforts to provide psychological support, legal assistance, and socioeconomic support. Finally, Mr. President, I would like to reiterate that Ethiopia has unwavering commitment to the respect, protection, and fulfillment of all the human rights of women and to women's equal and meaningful participation in all political processes. It is on this basis we will further scrutinize the report with a view to addressing any relevant aspects of recommendations contained therein. While we commit to continue our engagement with the Office of the SRSG, we hope the Special Representative will sufficiently reflect the inputs we provide and operate within the defined scope. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. And at the outset, Thailand wishes to express its appreciation to the United Kingdom for convening this open debate on this important issue of conflict-related sexual violence. I also thank the Secretary General for his recent report, as well as all the briefers for their contributions. Despite all the efforts that we have made towards elimination of all acts of violence against civilians in armed conflict, it is clear from the Secretary General's report that conflict-related sexual violence remains persistent and widespread. This sad reality is also echoed in his annual report on children in armed conflict, which was distributed just last month. Girls continue to be disproportionately affected by sexual violence in conflicts. This cannot continue. Thailand unequivocally condemns sexual violence, both in times of conflict and in times of peace, as well as the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. The growing trend of such criminal acts is indeed worrisome, and more should be done to address this issue. We strongly believe that the international community and all parties involved in conflict must strengthen their efforts in implementing the relevant Security Council resolutions to ensure the protection of civilians. In this regard, I wish to highlight the following 4 points. First, prevention is key. Thailand believes that the protection and promotion of women's rights, the empowerment of women, and the advancement of gender equality are fundamental elements to combating sexual violence. Therefore, it is essential to reduce pre-existing structural inequalities, eradicate all forms of discrimination, and combat extreme poverty among women and girls. We need to recognize that their meaningful participation within our societies as active agents of change is fundamental for our prevention efforts. Second, we must protect and guarantee the rights of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. To avoid marginalization and stigmatization of victims, survivor-centered approaches need to be employed to ensure their access to services and justice. In parallel, effective investigation and prosecution of sexual violence crimes need to be reinforced to uphold the perpetrators accountable as well as to prevent the recurrence of this human rights violation. Third, Thailand wishes to reiterate our full support to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and continues to look for ways to strengthen our commitment. We fully recognize the role of women as security providers and peace builders, not just as victims. Specific measures should be undertaken to ensure women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all levels of peace and security dialogue and processes. In this connection, we support the recommendation to increase deployment of women peacekeepers in line with the Uniformed Gender Parity Strategy 2018-2028. We commend the work of women's protection advisors in all UN peacekeeping operations and special political missions and encourage further deployment of WPAs. Fourth and lastly, As a troop and police contributing country, Thailand adheres to the policy of zero tolerance of sexual exploitation and abuse in UN peacekeeping operations. In the meantime, we are convinced that all military and police personnel throughout the entire chain of command, regardless of their gender, should receive adequate training to effectively prevent and respond to sexual violence. In this regard, Thailand supports the call to provide technical support and capacity building for troop and police contributing countries through both pre-deployment and in-mission training. Mr. President, in closing, sexual violence against people of any gender, whether in times of conflict or peace, has no justification. We must do all our part. We all must do our part and step up our efforts to end the cycles of sexual violence in all instances, once and for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Thailand for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Australia.
Thank you very much. Australia thanks the United Kingdom for convening today's open debate and for its continued leadership on conflict-related sexual violence. Notwithstanding the many Security Council resolutions and the comprehensive nature of states' obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law, women and girls continue to be subjected to sexual violence in conflict-affected settings, including in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Ukraine and Sudan. Australia strongly condemns the harassment, the use of force and rape as instruments of repression and political intimidation against women peace builders and human rights defenders. The targeting of public health facilities, impeding access to services by survivors, is unacceptable. Australia's commitment to eliminating sexual violence in conflict is long-standing. We are committed to addressing technology-facilitated gender-based violence, delivering justice, and holding perpetrators to account. We welcome the deployment of women's protection advisors in UN peacekeeping missions. Australia's Defence Force, our Federal Police, and our Department of Foreign Affairs train and deploy gender advisors on military, police, humanitarian, relief and recovery, and crisis operations and missions. We also prioritise efforts to create more diverse and inclusive military and police institutions through our support to the ELSI Initiative Fund and to UN Women to accelerate the meaningful representation of uniformed women across all levels of UN peace operations. Australia is also a founding member of the Call to Action on Protection from Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies. Survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are not a homogenous group, hence the need for responding to intersecting forms of discrimination and tailored survivor-centred action. This includes employing the MURAD Code and ensuring that persons subjected to sexual violence in conflict have access to safe, comprehensive support and services. We encourage Member States to promote accountability for sexual and gender-based violence and for the Security Council to continue to counter impunity with all the means at its disposal. We are particularly concerned about the link between private military security companies and reports of sexual violence. Existing frameworks, such as the Montreux document, are important tools to help close the gap on attribution and accountability. Efforts to prevent and resolve conflict cannot be separated from efforts to address sexual and gender-based violence. We must do more. We must implement the Security Council resolutions that condemn conflict-related sexual violence and fully implement the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Argentina.
Thank you very much, President. We are grateful for the convening of this important open debate and also for the briefings from the Special Representative Pramila Patten and the representatives of civil society. We're also grateful for the work undertaken by Ms. Patten. Over the course of history, rape and sexual violence have been used as weapons of war, frequently as a deliberate strategy during hostilities. Since the adoption of Resolution 1820 of the Security Council, there has been growing public awareness of these crimes and their consequences. Sexual violence perpetuates conflict and instability. Its destructive nature in the long term has a devastating effect not only on the survivors of this crime but on entire communities. Despite the many international instruments that require protection of civilians against sexual attacks during armed conflict and instruments that recognize that such acts may constitute war crimes, CRSV continues to prevail under a culture of almost total impunity. Conflict-related sexual violence, CRSV, can be exacerbated in contexts where a severe gender inequality prevails, which contributes to its normalization. Gender inequality is an underlying cause of sex crime and at the same time an obstacle to its prevention. Systematic and generalized prevention of sexualized violence begins in times of peace by the adoption of national laws that are sufficiently robust as regards the criminalization of such behavior. States must have legislative and institutional and judicial mechanisms that are prepared to deal with this issue in a comprehensive way. Crimes linked to sexual violence have a gender impact. The discussions around these crimes are generally focused on violence by men against women and girls. However, this discussion needs to be expanded. It should include the impacts that these criminal acts have when they are perpetrated against men, boys, and LGBTIQ+ individuals. In such cases, there is actually a high level of underreporting. When combined with reprisals, discrimination, and stigmatization, contribute to the generalized impunity against the perpetrators. Holding perpetrators to account for sexual violence is vital in order to ensure justice for the victims and to deter the commission of future crimes from being committed. These crimes can, in fact, be prosecuted under international law, and it is states that have the obligation to do so. When a state does not have the will or ability to investigate and prosecute international crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence, the international community should take the necessary measures in order to bring the situation to the International Criminal Court. The Rome statutes clearly criminalize rape and any other form of sexual violence as war crimes and crimes against humanity. One of the spaces where sexual violence can occur is schools or the path to school. Resolution 2601 of the Security Council on the protection of education during armed conflict expresses concern for the consequences of attacks that women and girls may suffer, including rape and other forms of sexual violence. These can impede a continuity in their education. In this regard, we would like to draw attention to the Safe Schools Declaration, a political commitment, an intergovernmental one that seeks to guarantee safe education and to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. In this regard, we would urge all states who have not yet done so to accede to this document, which now has more than 100 signatories. In conclusion, we wish to recall that in 2015, following the initiative of Argentina and the United Kingdom, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 69/293, through which the 19th of June of each year was proclaimed the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. The purpose is to raise awareness on the need to put an end to CRSV, to honor the victims and survivors of sexual violence, and to pay tribute to all those who have bravely devoted their lives to the struggle towards eradicating these crimes and those who have lost their lives in this undertaking. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Argentina for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the briefer for their input. Mr. President, armed conflict have a devastating and disproportionate impact on women and girls, rendering them the primary victims of violence, displacement, and human rights violations. The use of sexual violence as a tactic in such conflicts is an abhorrent crime disproportionately affect women and girls who bear the brunt of its horrific brutality. Iran strongly condemns all forms of sexual violence perpetrated during armed conflict and calls upon all parties to the conflict to comply with their obligation under international law. Within our volatile region, the Middle East, the threat posed by the foreign occupation, interference, and terrorism gravely jeopardize the rights and safety of women, disregarding their security needs. Mr. President, addressing this inhuman practice necessitates a collaborative approach. The Security Council resolution relevant to armed conflict explicitly underscored the imperative of combating conflict-related sexual violence and emphasizing accountability for these heinous acts. The primary goal is to foster an environment that effectively prevents and responds to such violence while safeguarding and empowering victims. However, achieving success in prevention hinges upon addressing the root causes primary armed conflict themselves. Consequently, the ultimate solution to curbing these crimes lies in the complete elimination of armed conflicts. Unfortunately, as long as terrorism, violent extremism, foreign occupation, and foreign interference persist, obtaining this solution remains elusive. In the interim, our effort must be concentrated on advancing women's empowerment, initiatives such as enhancing access to education, economic opportunities, and healthcare services. Moreover, specific measures such as strengthening the rule of law, ensuring the effective functioning of the justice system, and providing comprehensive support to victims are pivotal in protecting women and girls from sexual violence during armed conflicts. Equally vital is the promotion of accountability, which serves as a crucial aspect of addressing conflict-related sexual violence. It is of utmost importance that the international community responds decisively, particularly in cases where these reprehensible crimes are perpetrated by foreign occupying forces in conflict zones. In conclusion, Mr. President, we categorically refute the groundless allegation and unjustified references made against Iran in the Secretary General's recent reports on sexual violence in armed conflict. This allegation is absolutely false and was made without solid evidence and based solely on unreliable and distorted information from media sources. Considering the report's specific focus on the sexual violence in armed conflict, it is deeply concerning. The SRSG has overstepped its mandate by bringing unfounded claims to a member state that have nothing to do with armed conflicts. We strongly object to and condemn such irresponsible actions which undermine the integrity of the report and the UN in general. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the outset, I wish to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this annual debate on important issue of conflict-related sexual violence. I also thank SRSG's Pramila Patten and civil society representatives, including one from Myanmar, for their insightful briefings this morning. Mr. President, this year's report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence informs of the worrying trends of sexual violence across the world. In many situations, including my own country, Myanmar, civilians were exposed to higher levels of sexual violence as a result of the collapse of the rule of law and the escalation of the conflict following unconstitutional changes of government. Patterns of sexual violence deepened. Sexual violence continued to be used as a deliberate tactic of war. It was also used as part of political violence to intimidate and punish opponents. Impunity remained pervasive. Mr. President, it has long been documented and well known to the United Nations that Myanmar military uses sexual violence such as rape and gang rape during conflicts as a tactic of war. After the illegal military coup in February 2021, the security and police forces under the direct control of the illegitimate military junta have been using sexual violence systematically as a tactic of war, political oppression, intimidation, and retaliation. The CSO representative, Ms. Hser from Myanmar, informed the Council of the true and devastating situation in Myanmar, especially heartbreaking situation that women and girls are facing. Taking this opportunity, I wish to thank and salute Ms. Hser and all women human rights defenders for their tireless efforts and bravery for protecting women and girls and promoting their rights. While echoing what Ms. Hser said earlier this morning, I wish to appeal that please do not kill and harm people by aiming or supporting the military junta. Mr. President, clearly and sadly, the people of Myanmar, particularly women and girls, are facing severe suffering caused by the military junta. I have repeatedly informed this Council and the General Assembly that the violence and atrocities being committed by the military junta since the coup are not isolated incidents. They are so widespread, targeted, and systematic that the UN Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, IIMM, concluded that they could amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. I appreciate the Secretary General and SRSG Patten for rightly listing Myanmar militaries, including its border guard, in this year's report's list of parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of rape or other forms of sexual violence in situations of armed conflict. On the other hand, the National Unity Government of Myanmar, in line with the Federal Democracy Charter, has taken a people-centered approach to advance the women, peace, and security agenda through civic actors. The NUG has been doing its best in every way to make sure its people defense forces adhering to the rule of engagement and to the international humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, women and girls in Myanmar, particularly in conflict areas, need protection from the military sexual violence. The survivor deserve justice. The junta is unwilling to address sexual violence being committed by its personnel. Instead, they maintain a culture of impunity among the rank and file. To put an end to these heinous crimes of sexual violence in Myanmar, we must transform the military institution from the main sexual violence perpetrator to a professional and accountable institution that is subject to the rule of law and democratic oversight, as well as federal democratic norms and principles. This is a key goal of our ongoing revolution against this military dictatorship in Myanmar. I agree with and endorse the demands made this morning by CSO representative Ms. Hser for the further action of the Security Council. In addition, I wish to make the following appeal. It is important that the UN system continue to work with and support women-led organizations, women CSO leaders, and human rights defenders in monitoring and documenting the sexual violence situation in Myanmar and assisting the survivors through every possible way. All individual member states should support Myanmar women, among others, by giving protection to those who fled the junta's atrocities and by supporting women-led organizations and initiatives. The Security Council should give serious attention to the situation of women and girls in Myanmar, especially in conflict-affected areas. It should demand an immediate end to sexual violence being committed by the military. More importantly, Council should take concrete actions to end the military impunity. These specific demands should be included in a follow-up enforceable resolution to the Council Resolution 2669. As such, I wish to urge the members of the UN Security Council to start now a negotiation process to adopt timely and enforceable resolution on Myanmar. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Myanmar for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank the British Presidency of the UN Security Council for the timely organization of this meeting on the important issue of CRSV, as well as the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict for her insightful presentation. We reiterate our full support to her mandate. We also congratulate the members of the civil society who made invaluable contributions today. Mr. President, my delegation fully subscribes to the statement delivered by the European Union. I would like to make some additional remarks in my national capacity. Cyprus strongly condemns gender-based violence in all its forms and manifestations, online and offline, including all acts of sexual violence against civilians in armed conflicts. Despite progress made since the unanimous adoption of Resolution 1820 of the Security Council in 2008, the abhorrent crime of conflict-related sexual violence continues, and impunity, regrettably, prevails in many cases. Victims and survivors are often living ashamed in the shadow, awaiting justice and redress. We are deeply concerned by the growing use of sexual violence as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism, including by the severity and brutality of such incidents. Numbers cannot lie and are only the tip of the iceberg, since many cases remain unreported. These heinous CRSV crimes can be facilitated and promoted also online, utilizing digital channels. We note with concern that women and girls, constituting the majority of the CRSV victims, are disproportionately affected by the gender-digital divide. Cyprus recalls that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute a war crime, a crime against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. CRSV is a peace and security issue and an impediment to restoration of peace, requiring specific operational and policy responses. These heinous crimes should not remain unanswered and cannot be addressed in isolation. Member States have obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. It is their responsibility to prevent and address such violence, to protect and support survivors and bring perpetrators to justice. In this regard, Cyprus joins others in calling all parties to armed conflicts, including non-state armed groups, to cease acts of sexual violence immediately and completely against civilians, and to implement action plans to prevent and address sexual violence in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law and all the relevant Security Council resolutions. Prosecution and accountability are keys to ensuring long-lasting peace. Therefore, we need to strengthen legal procedures at national, regional, and international levels, ensuring that all victims of sexual violence, particularly women and girls, have equal protection under the law and equal access to justice. Addressing the culture of impunity is our common responsibility. The international community has also an obligation to ensure accountability for such crimes when national institutions are unable or unwilling to do so. The Security Council must use all tools at its disposal to support action against CRSV as a tactic of war. A survivor-centered approach must guide all our actions and responses to CRSV. We should always take into consideration that survivors are not a homogeneous group. They have different needs and perspectives that we need to take into consideration in addressing the trauma that victims, survivors, and their families are experiencing, including by ensuring access to medical care and psychosocial support. Mr. President, as a country that has experienced the atrocity of CRSV firsthand, Cyprus attaches great importance to the elimination of all forms of gender-based violence and joins calls to accelerate efforts towards their elimination. In this regard, Cyprus has adopted action plans and strategies related to gender equality, including legislative measures highlighting and promoting the positive role women have as agents of change. Mr. President, it is imperative to address the root causes of sexual violence in conflict settings and of gender-based violence, deeply rooted in historical inequalities which perpetuate the problem. In this regard, the full, equal, and meaningful participation and involvement of women in all efforts for the maintenance of peace and security is a sine qua non for the full implementation of the peace and security agenda, including in addressing CRSV. To conclude, Cyprus remains committed to continue working with the international community to strengthen the global response to CRSV in order to protect and empower women, girls, men, and boys in all their diversity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Cyprus for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
I thank you, Mr. President. First, we'd like to wish the delegation of the United Kingdom every success in its presidency over the Council for this month, and we'd also like to express our appreciation to the United Arab Emirates for their successful presidency of the Council last month. I would like to thank Pramila Patten, SRSG, for her report. Mr. President, Iraq was among the first Arab countries to draw up a national plan for the implementation of Resolution 1325 in order to guarantee the meaningful and effective participation of women. And here I would like to indicate several government measures that were taken in the field. First, the electoral law of 2021 allowed Iraqi women to enter the elections in force. This led to 97 women being voted into the parliament, thus exceeding the female quota that was set. Second, the Iraqi National Women's Strategy 2023-2030 was launched, and this includes elements of participation, protection, economic empowerment, as well as other social elements. Third, Iraq has established domestic violence shelters, and we are currently working on preparing standardized regulations to govern the work of these shelters. 4, we are working on guaranteeing the prosecution of the perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence with a zero-tolerance policy towards them. They have been excluded from any amnesty that is issued. 5th, in terms of the progress achieved in the application of the law to compensate Yazidi survivors, the government started work on a database of women and girls covered by the law. Moreover, the Survivors Directorate launched in March of this year the first round of stipends that were issued to the survivors, and we are working to list the rest of the survivors in this database. 6, 72,000 national IDs were issued to women and children in the liberated areas and to IDPs as well. 7th, the General Directorate for Survivors Affairs is working on activating a referral system with 10 organizations specializing in psychosocial support so as to offer psychosocial support services to the survivors so they can be rehabilitated and reintegrated in society. 8, Iraq continues to deal with the aftermath of the terrorist Daesh movement, and we continue to strive to achieve justice and uphold justice for the victims and their families. We stress the need that justice must not be long awaited, and because that would contribute to the impunity of the perpetrators of the crimes and would harm the principle of justice itself. Therefore, we stress the importance of the UNITAD team handing over evidence that was gathered as part of investigation processes verified as completed to the Iraqi judiciary in accordance with their jurisdiction so that it can move ahead in prosecuting suspects in a manner that is full, fair, transparent, and without any delay. In closing, Mr. President, and at a time while we condemn all the heinous crimes that were perpetrated by the terrorist Daesh organization, we do not support taking advantage of this latest report to use inappropriate terminology. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Iraq for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Namibia.
Mr. President, Namibia thanks you for organizing this open debate on women, peace, and security. As a champion of the women, peace, and security agenda, we are, as always, encouraged by the overwhelming support for this open debate. Conflict-related sexual violence is a serious and abhorrent crime that implies a collective moral obligation and provokes a sense of urgency. Therefore, it's concerning that despite this Council adopting resolutions that recognize CRSV as a tactic of war and terrorism, it persists and in some settings has even increased, with impunity remaining the norm. CRSV occurs on a continuum of interrelated and recurring forms of violence against women and girls. The consequences for victims and their communities are both immediate and long-term. It not only violates the human rights of its victims, but also devastates families and communities, with the impacts of these crimes echoing across generations, manifested through gender inequalities, trauma, stigma, poverty, and poor health and well-being. In Africa, this greatly impacts our potential to harness the demographic dividend, as it impedes the potential of women and girls. Impunity results in children and young girls learning that sexual violence is acceptable, and regressive violent customs and practices reappear. United Nations Security Council Resolution 2467 recalls that it is the responsibilities of states to end impunity and to prosecute those responsible for crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes perpetrated against civilians, including CRSV. In seeking to bridge the existing implementation gaps, we must ensure gender mainstreaming in peacekeeping and peace building, sensitize participating in peacekeeping missions on gender issues, and ensure that gender sensitization is part of the preparation of troops and police who are participating in peacekeeping missions, advocate for more women to be included in peacekeeping missions at all levels of decision-making and peacekeeping process, ensure that personnel being deployed to conflict areas are aware of the causes of conflict and effective strategies of conflict management, and ensure that measures are in place to hold members of peacekeeping forces accountable to the commission of CRSV or other violations such as sexual exploitation, rape, or other forms of gender-based violence. The Women, Peace and Security agenda was born out of a need to promote women's participation in efforts and processes aimed at pursuing peace and security, the prevention of all forms of violence against women and girls, and the protection of women in conflict and non-conflict situations, as well as the need to situate women not only as victims, but also as key actors in the development of gender-responsive peace and security policies and programming. As we continue to drive forward action on women, peace and security and CRSV, we must ensure that the rights and needs of sexual violence survivors are at the heart of response efforts and interventions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Namibia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to express appreciation to the UK presidency for the leadership in bringing this important issue to the forefront of today's discussions. We also thank the UN Secretary General for his recent latest report. Georgia aligned with the statement of the European Union made earlier today, and I would like to make these additional comments in my personal capacity, in my national capacity. Unfortunately, sexual violence continues to be used as a strategy of warfare and a tactic of terror, shattering lives and scarring communities, which is often presented in military conflicts and has an immense impact on innocent civilians. This horrendous crime affects all people, though it disproportionately impacts women and girls. We are concerned over the findings of the Secretary General's report on violations in several countries. We condemn the documented cases of sexual violence and of using it as a method of torture by the Russian forces and Russian-affiliated armed groups in Ukraine. Excellencies, evidence from the research and practice shows that conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence is not an inevitable byproduct of war, and it can be prevented. Eliminating sexual violence during conflict must be a priority for the international community. It can be prevented by strengthening national and international efforts, raising awareness and ensuring justice. The adoption of the UN Security Council resolutions on conflict-related sexual violence paved the way for states to establish a firm normative framework that can address the CRSV as an issue of peace and security. With this in mind, the government of Georgia joined the 50-plus states at the London Conference on the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict last year, endorsing the declaration which aims to urgently accelerate action to end conflict-related sexual violence, hold those responsible to account, shatter the existing culture of impunity, provide more comprehensive support to survivors, and tackle stigma. Here, let me use this occasion to commend the UK for the successful conduct of this substantial conference. Furthermore, at the conference, Georgia undertook also national commitments outlining the steps to address conflict-related sexual violence through contributing to the strengthened global response, undertaking policies and programs to tackle the harmful gender norms that drive sexual violence, strengthening justice for the CRSV, and supporting survivors and children born as a result of CRSV. Moreover, promotion of the women's rights and gender equality, including in the military, remains among top priorities of my government. Gender equality strategy of the Ministry of Defense of Georgia establishes the conditions required to guarantee equal rights, freedoms, and opportunities for men and women, prevent and eradicate all forms of discrimination, counter any kind of gender violence, and eliminate the misconduct, sexual harassment, and physical and psychological mistreatment. The Georgian Ministry of Defense also continues with efforts to increase capacity of peacekeeping personnel on preventing and responding to sexual and gender-based violence, including in conflict and post-conflict situations. All peace mission deployed personnel are trained on the UNSC resolutions on women, peace, and security in the frame of mandatory pre-deployment trainings. Let me mention herewith that in October 2022, the Georgian government adopted subsequent national action plan on the implementation of the UN resolutions 1325 on women, peace, and security for 2022-2024. However, the illegal occupation of the Georgian regions of Abkhazia and Skhinvali region, South Ossetia, by the Russian Federation remains the main obstacle for the Georgian government to implement the human rights protection framework for the women and girls, remaining on the other side of the illegally erected barbed wire fences, who are systematically subjected to human rights violations, including the denial of the right to freedom of movement, threats to physical security for the so-called illegal border crossing, and illegal detentions. Recently, there has been an extremely worrisome pattern observed increasingly targeting the Georgian women. The outrageous practice of illegal detentions is being used as an instrument of terror against one of the most vulnerable groups. International engagement and monitoring of the situation inside the conflict-affected regions and the Russia-occupied regions of Georgia in particular is therefore a paramount to ensure substantive gender equality and prevent the sexual violence against women. Thank you.
The representative of Georgia for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.